We were a team, despite our differences, in spite of the terrible things they'd done. We were still a team. That's not how the higher-ups saw it, though. No, the guys upstairs with their perfectly pressed shirts. For them, we were judged by our level of expendability, and they knew that our next mission was a death sentence. One by one, that thing took out my team, my friends, snapping their necks so quickly and with such ease that no sooner did I hear the scream, they were dead. We had been used. I'd been used. Delivered as prey to the predator. A plot that was sanctioned by the bosses and approved with a blood-red stamp. Why did they do it? I'm still trying to figure that out. Maybe that's something you can tell me after you hear how these so-called scientific men left us in this cell. And in the hands of SCP-173. For me, it had been the best of times before it became the worst of times. The best because I'd quickly risen through the ranks of the facility. The worst because, well, I'll get to that. I was never the best student. I finished high school by the skin of my teeth, and my job prospects looked bleak. But I was lucky, I guess. Or at least I thought so at the time. You see, I have an uncle Siegfried who did some work for the government. I never actually knew what he did, just that it was secretive work. I used to imagine he was some sort of super spy, so you can imagine how excited I was when he found out I needed a job and he offered to help me out. I couldn't believe it. I always thought he hated me. I'd overheard him telling my parents that I was a no-good deadbeat, but now he'd had a change of heart and was willing to take me under his wing. What would I get to do? Undercover intelligence gathering? International assassinations? Just you wait, he said. And that's how I found myself walking into a sprawling, futuristic-looking facility where they handed me a level 1 security clearance card with big, bold letters that read, Janitor. But I was happy. Just the words security clearance made me feel important, and it beat flipping burgers. I pushed mops, turned off lights, fired up generators, clocked in and clocked out. But all that time they must have been watching me, grooming me, waiting for the day they could throw me to the wolves. I should have known. I've always been an expendable kind of guy. After a few years, I was called to an office, and there was a man in a plaid shirt and kind of a tweed jacket that professors wear. He asked me, "Do you have any idea about what we actually do here?" And to be honest, I didn't. I knew that there were many parts of the facility I couldn't enter. I imagined that down a maze of corridors were weapons being built, or prisoners being interrogated. But I had no idea about the anomalies. How could I? Before I was told anything, I had to sign a bunch of forms. There were so many I thought I'd get to find out who really killed JFK. And while they didn't come out and say it, what I inferred was that if I ever talk about what happens at the facility to someone outside the facility, well, let's just say it's not the kind of thing they'd spell out on a piece of paper, but it involves padded cells and rusty tools. I wasn't scared though. I was part of something big, something secret, and I loved it. So I signed my life away with no hesitation. Soon after, I was introduced to my first anomaly, the safe class, of course. They took me to an observation room, and from that room I could see into another room with a sign on the wall that read SCP-067. I just stood there, waiting for something to happen, when in walked another guy in a white lab coat. "Welcome to your first anomaly," he said. "Is it okay if I hook you up to this heart monitor? We want to gauge your reaction to what you see." "All I can see," I told him, "is an empty room with a table and what looks like a pen on top of some papers." "Correct," he said, half smiling, as if I was some kind of idiot. "That's SCP-067. I thought about telling him that if I needed years of training before I could see a pen, that I probably should have taken that fast food job. Could have been a shift manager by now. Then they brought a young chimpanzee into the room, small enough to be harmless. One of the guys forced a pen into the scared chimp's hand and something strange happened. It started scribbling. Nonsense at first, but suddenly it was sketching and drawing faster and faster. I could catch glimpses of words and images. By the time they dragged it out, it was flailing around like it was possessed. "That pen has power," said the man in the lab coat. "A power whose source or origin we don't fully understand. That's why we're here. That's why you are here." One of the guys in the other room held the chimp's drawing up to the window. It was a perfect sketch of the Tower of London, intricate and brilliant. Above the sketch was the title, Tower of London, Tudor Period, circa 1541. The year Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, lost her head on the chopping block. Underneath that, the chimp had written, "Pity. She was no traitor." Take it from me, I was there. They didn't need to look at the heart rate monitor to see that I was shocked. That was far from the only anomaly I'd come into contact with, and I must have been doing something right, because in time I went from level 1 to 2 to level 3 security clearance, and that's when they made me a containment specialist. I won't bore you with all the details, but as you can guess, I dealt with the containment of anomalies. A lot of my time was spent looking through small windows and cell doors, making sure that whatever was inside and still in one piece. Other times I worked with field agents when anomalies were brought in, a transition period that the arrested freaks didn't much like. There was one certain anomaly, though, that I was tasked to oversee on many occasions. I like to think of it as my pet, but in hindsight, I was its pet. This was SCP-173, something that was in what we call the Euclid class, a classification meaning that we don't fully understand it, but know it is very dangerous. We know it's intelligent, we know it's unpredictable, and we know it will kill. And for that reason, there's people tasked with containing it and keeping an eye on it at all times. At first glance, you wouldn't guess just how dangerous 173 is. You wouldn't think it's incredibly intelligent. In fact, you'd think the opposite. That's because it's more or less a walking slab of concrete and rebar with stunted limbs and traces of spray paint that give the impression of a dopey face. We have to enter its cell twice a week for cleaning duties. It leaves a disgusting, foul-smelling liquid on the floor, a reddish-brown substance that I can only describe as a mix of blood and waste products. Where that stuff comes from has remained a mystery since we first contained it in 1993. Going into the cell was always a three-man job, because, and this is maybe the weirdest part about 173, it can't move if human eyes are watching it. That's why you need at least 2 people watching it at all times. If you were in the room watching 173 by yourself and blinked, you'd be dead before your eyes opened. We don't know how it moves that fast, but in that fraction of a second, your neck is snapped so hard it's almost like being decapitated. I've seen the videos to prove it. All it took was a sneeze. He wasn't even finished getting the rest of the achoo out when there was a flash and his partner was left lying on the ground. His head twisted around the wrong direction. So, you can understand why we now require 3 men for any time we must enter 173's cell. Then, a few months ago, I was told that a long process would begin to train and re-educate some future Class Ds. Class Ds are mostly prisoners with lifelong sentences, or those we've taken from death row and given a new lease on life. We were apparently understaffed, so why not employ these men whose lives had pretty much ended anyway? That was the rationale, or at least that's what they told me. I was told to train them on their new job, mopping up 173's mess, so that me and the rest of the containment specialists could focus on more important tasks. They hadn't been through the training I had, seen what I had seen. But after showing them the video of 173 nearly taking off a man's head, they were more than willing to follow the rules. They understood not to blink or turn away or sneeze, and that any lapse in focus could lead to a violent death. So I started to show them the ropes, how we move as a team into the cell and always keep the others informed on what we're doing. 173 was always sitting in the corner of a cell, no expression on that crude face. But when we walked in its cell, I got the feeling it knew something had changed. I felt almost as if it was communicating with me, but I couldn't tell what it was trying to say. And then, it happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days from the last time we'd cleaned. As usual, 173 had covered the floor with that horrible liquid. We headed in to clean, my new team alert as always, and some of them cleaned while others kept their eyes focused on the thing in the corner. Things were going smoothly when we heard a noise I knew very well. It was the sound of the cell door locking. Someone must have screwed up. "Hey guys, we're locked in here," I shouted through the intercom. Nothing. "Guys, the damn door is locked." Nothing. I lost it a bit. "Open the door, will you?" Nothing. My team looked at me. The ones not on eye contact duty, that is, as if I should know what to do, hoping that this had happened before and that there was some kind of standard plan to deal with it. There wasn't. We were always observed when in the room, and I knew that a technician couldn't accidentally lock the door. It was impossible. There were protocols. Someone had done this on purpose. The four of us sat in the corner of the room as far from 173 as possible, our eyes locked on it. It didn't move an inch as usual, just stood, staring at the wall as it always did. We stayed awake through the night, talking a little, holding on to the slim hope that something had gone wrong. But as night turned to day again, we all began to lose hope. We weren't sent here to clean. We were a test, totally expendable. Lab rats. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. We couldn't just stay up forever. That was a death sentence. I suggested that two of us stand, one sit and rest, and one get some sleep. We'd take shifts. A couple hours on, a couple hours off. Maybe we could show that we wouldn't give up. They'd have time to realize what they were doing was insane, call off the test, and come free us. We made it through a couple of shifts like this, and it seemed like we'd actually be able to make it another day or two when everything went wrong. It was my turn to sit and rest when I heard the worst possible noise. Snoring. The con next to me was sleeping quietly, so it must be one of the standers. I glanced over for just a split second and saw both of them, leaning against the cell wall, dozing. At the same time, I saw the flash. Crack, snap, pop. One after another, their necks were snapped. I'm not sure how it happened, but I was standing again, staring at 173, who was now in the corner. Dead bodies with their heads twisted around piled up in front of it. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stare at this thing forever. I felt myself giving up. I lowered my head to the ground and then finally broke my gaze, ready to die. And then, nothing happened. I slowly raised my head back up and there it was, its hideous face inches away from mine. It was then that I understood what we'd been containing, what we'd underestimated. I felt it again, like it was telling me something. It was telling me to close my eyes, to sleep. So I did. But as my eyes closed, I didn't see darkness. I saw 173, or something like it, but not in the cell. I saw it outside, in the world, standing over children sleeping in their beds, watching. I saw them hiding in the shadows, staring out at passers-by. Then I realized they weren't watching, waiting to pounce. No, they were hiding. My eyes popped open as the door opened and in rushed 6 security personnel. They took me outside, jabbed my leg with a syringe, injecting me with something as the world faded away. Incident report. Time and date redacted. Following the experimental forced interaction with Euclid class anomaly SCP-173, subject has ceased responding to external stimuli and appears to have taken on the traits and behaviors of the anomaly. Subject now spends entire day sitting in corner of cell staring at the wall. Staff are advised to proceed with caution when dealing with subject, as the only behavior they engage in is an attempt to strangle anyone who enters the cell. No treatments have shown any effectiveness, and subject will unfortunately require incarceration, likely forever. SCP-173. It's one of the most iconic anomalies ever contained by the SCP Foundation. This neck-snapping Site-19 celebrity is known and feared by everyone who works at the Foundation since being contained in 1993. Its nubby concrete hands metaphorically and quite literally stained with the blood of countless people. But this mostly immobile oddity wasn't always a resident of Site-19, and the story of how exactly it ended up there, and more importantly why, is far more ridiculous, insane, and downright terrifying than you could ever imagine. So buckle up, SCP fans, this is the dramatic tale of how this homicidal piece of modern art ended up at the SCP Foundation's largest containment site. To give you an idea of just how weird this origin story is, we're gonna have to leap forward to the year of 2045. We know what you're thinking. Isn't this a prequel? How can it take place in the future? Sit tight, folks. It'll all make sense in the end. Site-91 is where we lay our scene, under the watchful eyes of Site Director Dr. James Long, a senior researcher with Level 4 security clearance, the second highest at the Foundation. Dr. Long had given decades of devotion and his expertise to the Foundation. He was a proud man who wore his life of service to the containment cause as a badge of honor. After years of dodging death while researching some of the most dangerous anomalies that Site-91 had to offer, he had ascended to the rank of Site Director, which represented the culmination of his life's work. And in his new position of power, he'd only proved himself further running a tight ship, and reducing the number of containment breaches across the board. Nobody could say that Dr. Long wasn't extremely talented at his job, which is why he was so confused when he received an email from Alexandra Nala, an administrative assistant working directly for the O5 Council. It was the type of email that no site director ever wanted to receive. Dr. Long was being told that, with no input or oversight from him, the majority of Site-91's anomalies were going to be taken to an undisclosed location for safer containment. The list contained nearly every meaningful detainee contained on the site, including, of course, SCP-173. This particular anomaly had been contained at the site for 37 years after being delivered there in 2008. Dr. Long had devised a perfect method to minimize containment breaches in that time, creating a sprinkler system within the chamber that washes away the waste products produced by 173, reducing the need for risky human contact. But that didn't matter. Despite Dr. Long's loyalty and efficacy in serving the SCP Foundation, the decision had already been made, with no chance of reversing it. According to Nala, the motion to remove most of Site-91's anomalies had received unanimous approval from the O5 Council, and the operations for the transfer would be commandeered by the Department of Extra-Universal Affairs, headed by Senior Agent Sven Kish. Dr. Long was both upset and confused. He was producing some of the best results across the entire Foundation, so why were they taking away all of his anomalies? Did someone on the O5 Council have it out for him? Dr. Long replied to Nala asking if, considering how severe the relocation operation was going to be, whether he could get more information on where the anomalies were being moved to, and why. He felt that at the very least, he was owed some answers on this. Nala and her superiors didn't feel quite the same way. She replied that Dr. Long sadly didn't have the clearance to know any of the operation's particulars. This information was reserved for those with Level 5 clearance and members of the Multi-Universal Department. All that Dr. Long needed to do was stay out of the way, and everything would be taken care of for him. But that wasn't enough for Dr. Long. He needed to know more. He needed to understand why this seemingly random decision had been made. Realizing that Nala and the O5 Council were a dead end as far as information was concerned, he instead reached out to the next best thing, Senior Agent Sven Kish, the member of the Department of Extra-Universal Affairs who was spearheading the relocation mission. Dr. Long implored the agent to give him extra information on where all the Site-91 anomalies were being moved, and why they were being moved in the first place. Predictably, he was once again stonewalled, being told that any information regarding the project was above his level of clearance. In a move that seemed decidedly spiteful, Agent Kish signed off by saying that he looked forward to seeing Dr. Long at Site-91. And not long after that, he did. Agent Kish, along with a huge number of agents and task force members from the Multi-U department, arrived on site, bearing state-of-the-art containment equipment. And exasperated Dr. Long wasn't able to glean any more information from this experience. The Multi-U agents were ruthlessly efficient, transferring the lion's share of the anomalies into temporary containment and transporting them off-site within a few hours. By the time they were done, Dr. Long and his staff were left with one of the most desolate and empty containment sites on the Foundation's books. Here was Dr. Long, with decades of service and climbing the organizational ladder, only to be left as a glorified babysitter for a handful of low-priority anomalous items. It all felt like a cruel joke. After several days of nothing happening in the now incredibly uneventful Site-91, a bored Dr. Long reached out to a friend of his, researcher Nurul Shafika Binte Ahmad Ibrahim, whom he called by the nickname Shaq, to vent his frustrations. She commiserated, sharing her sympathy for his suddenly much less exciting working conditions, but saying that at least the job should be a little less lethal now. Shaq didn't know it yet, but on this particular point, she was terribly wrong. Dr. Long shared his theory that perhaps some sites were being consolidated so the Foundation could save money, and that this would lead to layoffs. Shaq essentially told him that he was worrying too much. The reality was that Dr. Long had some very good reasons to be worried. His problem was that he hadn't been worrying about the right things. In Foundation Containment Area 179, something awful was brewing. As usual, guards posted around SCP-2317, an old door containing a portal to another world, waited while Foundation staff and D-classes performed the standard Procedure 220 Calabasas ritual within. They were dealing with one of the most dangerous anomalies in the entire universe. But even then, after decades of service, one can be numb to such things. Suddenly, without warning, the door opened and a terrified Foundation researcher tumbled out, panting heavily, eyes bulging in existential horror. He screamed the words that he long hoped would never be spoken in his or even his children's lifetime. "It happened! The chains have broken! The Devourer is free!" The siren sounded, and an alert spread across the entire Foundation database. SCP-2317 is compromised. SCP-2317-K, the Devourer of Worlds, is free. If the creature escapes Area 179, an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario is basically assured. So all efforts will be taken to make sure that the creature does not escape at any cost, and they really did mean any cost. The old wooden door of SCP-2317 splintered as an immense scaly hand sprang forth and clawed a wave of devastation throughout the containment chamber. Guards were dispatched in the hundreds with heavy weaponry to buy some time, firing at the Devourer. A beast the size of a mountain rose from the ground, staring at the terrified humans below with its one gigantic red eye. It couldn't even feel the bullets, explosives, or incendiary and laser weaponry being used on it. The monster just shrugged it off and murdered nearly all of its attackers with one swipe of its claw. In a final desperate act, hoping to kill or at least slow down the beast, staff at Area 179 made the ultimate sacrifice and detonated the entire on-site nuclear arsenal. The explosion disintegrated the entire facility in an instant and unleashed a radioactive shockwave that carried destruction for miles. But it wasn't enough. SCP-2317-K walked out of the mushroom cloud without a scratch on it, ready to show the human world what real destruction meant. At this point, the battle was already effectively lost, but the Foundation refused to go down without a fight. They dispatched all available mobile task forces, including Mobile Task Force Nu 7 Hammerdown, a heavily armed battalion-strength task force created to combat the biggest and most extensive threats imaginable. And it wasn't even just the Foundation. True existential threats have a way of uniting people, as the GOC and even the Chaos Insurgency temporarily put aside their differences to take the fight to the Devourer. But would any of it be enough? Barrages of cruise missiles and ICBMs did nothing to halt the Devourer's assault, as it rampaged, destroying towns and cities at first, then regions, then whole nations. Swarms of scrambled jets and helicopters were knocked out of the sky with casual swipes. The creature bulldozed over landscapes teeming with tanks and heavy artillery vehicles. It snapped aircraft carriers in half as it waded from ocean to ocean, systematically destroying everything in its path. Even satellite-mounted orbital cannons and the heavy-energy weapons of MTF Tau-5, also known as Samsara, did nothing to phase the Devourer. It was finally coming to fruition. The dreaded XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, and none of the Foundation's expertise, advanced technology, or limitless resources could do anything to stop it. They aided in evacuation efforts, getting as many people as they could out of harm's way as the Devourer rampaged and destroyed, but even that was doing little more than borrowing time. Eventually, the Devourer would destroy all of them. There would be nothing left. And all Dr. James Long could do was watch helplessly from an almost empty Site-91, waiting for the tide of destruction to reach him. Of course, other Foundation employees, most prominently Senior Agent Sven Kish and the Multi-U department, had other concerns. All they needed to do was archive data for extraction. Extraction to where, you ask, seeing as the world seems to be at its end here? Well, Universe 7392 Epsilon Blue Lima, otherwise known as our universe, circa 1993. The Foundation works across the multiverse, and an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario in one universe really isn't necessarily a problem in others. On orders of the O5 Council, Agent Kish and his men are charged with extracting data and valuable anomalies like SCP-173 from doomed universes. O5 knew that Dr. Long's universe, Universe 5643 Gamma Orange Delta, was due for an apocalyptic visit from the Devourer of Worlds any day now. That's why the Multi-U team went in to extract everything worth saving. Dr. Long and the millions of other Level 4 and below employees of that universe's Foundation were never told of their impending doom. After all, That sort of thing could probably lead to unnecessary stress, and what they don't know won't hurt them, until, of course, it does. In 1993, these anomalous doomed universe SCPs were divided amongst our universe's various applicable containment sites. SCP-173, as you already know, ended up in Site 19, but sadly for the people working there, all the actual data files on this entries file were lost in translation, so as far as they knew, 173 was little more than a big weird statue with apparently dangerous properties. Upon first placing it in its containment chamber in Site 19 Euclid Wing, Foundation legend Dr. Bright, unaware of just what he had here, assigned Dr. William Moto to begin research on the entity. He recommended that the researcher bring 2 D-classes for testing. When Dr. Moto was faced with the anomalous entity's blank file, he gave a sigh and began to write something in its description box. Moved to Site 19, 1993. Origin is, as of yet, unknown. Wasn't that a delightful little tale? Now we know how SCP-173 made its way into Site 19, and what our own universe may have to look forward to in 2045. So remember, if you ever see Agent Sven Kish planning a transfer of anomalies out of your site, maybe consider using some of that PTO, and maybe consider putting a down payment on a nice, cozy apocalypse bunker over in Iceland.
Please, good sir, I beseech you, as a man of science, nay, as a man of reason, you mustn't stifle my research at this critical juncture. You have no idea how close I am to finding a cure for this blasted pestilence. I need only a handful of live subjects to complete my research.
The Plague Doctor's emphatic pleas fell on deaf ears, as a stone-faced researcher took notes on his latest pontifications. The Doctor, whom these clods had reduced so rudely to a mere number, SCP-049, banged his gloved fist up against the wall. And to think he once thought of these men as intellectual equals, fellow travelers on the road to scientific enlightenment. What a positively sick joke. Before the Doctor got another chance to appeal for his right to experiment, the researcher left him alone once more. A truly sad state of affairs. Nobody appreciated a true scientist in this day and age. It was sure to be another day of languishing alone in his cell, wishing he had the capacity to do more. So he was surprised as anyone when the alarm started going off, and the door of his cell swung open automatically. The Plague Doctor stepped out of his cell and into the hall, where many other humanoid anomalies were roaming, confused as to why they'd been suddenly released. What was happening? As it turned out, what was happening was one of the most brutal Chaos Insurgency raids the staff of Site 19 had ever seen. It had been planned immaculately. You see, guards rotate semi-regularly at Site 19 due to the high-pressure nature of the job. Lots of deaths and mental breakdowns, as you probably correctly predicted. Even the administrative staff of the SCP Foundation are only human. Well, mostly anyway. So they're not immune to little oversights here and there. And it's in those oversights that expertly trained Chaos Insurgency infiltration agents make their living. No less than 15 of them had been working undercover in Site 19 for just over 2 weeks, and they did a fine job of lowering the metaphorical drawbridge for a heavily armed invasion force. The guards who weren't plants were quickly murdered by the infiltrators, and even some of the on-site task forces were quickly overwhelmed and gunned down by the high-precision rifles of the Chaos Insurgency's finest. While the frontliners were distracted by the sudden assault, the infiltrators found their way to the site's security control room and massacred everyone inside. Opening every single door in the site was as simple as putting in a few stolen key codes and flipping a few carefully remembered switches. Consequently, while Foundation agents and Chaos Insurgency mercenaries clashed sabers, high-priority anomalies like SCP-049 simply wandered the facility, watching the calamity unfold within. The Foundation was beset on all sides, shot at by heavily armed maniacs, and attacked from within by the numerous roaming anomalous entities that were eager to get their hands on Foundation personnel. Definitely not an ideal situation, to say the least. The Plague Doctor only had one thing on his mind, though.
This definitely won't do my research any good, unless I can escape and find my way to a suitable laboratory. Oh, now there's an idea.
But his scientific fantasies were soon interrupted by a Chaos Insurgency soldier swinging the butt of his M4 carbine into his avian exoskull with a supremely unpleasant crack. The doctor was dazed by it momentarily, the pain coming at him like a thunderclap, but the insurgent never got the chance to take another swing. Before the insurgent could do anything, the plague doctor lunged out with practiced speed, grasping him by the throat. Immediately, everything went black, and the insurgent's limp corpse collapsed to the ground.
Serves him right,
the doctor internally mused.
Soldiers attacking medics is violating even the most basic rules of gentlemanly warfare.
Then another flash of immense pain, as a different rifle butt collided with the back of his head. The doctor fell to one knee, feeling dizzy, but before he could retaliate, he felt the two sharp prongs of a cattle prod pressing up against his neck. The sudden rush of electricity surged through his neck, sending his muscles into a wave of involuntary spasms. The insurgents crowding around him chimed in with their own agonizing cattle prods, relentlessly shocking him until the flashes of white-hot pain soon became an oppressive blanket of total dark. Even on his most cantankerous days, the SCP Foundation had never treated him like this. When he eventually came to, he was still in darkness, standing upright, with high-tech shackles holding every limb in place. It was beyond uncomfortable for the poor plague doctor, but it succeeded in the task of keeping him under control. He couldn't move an inch. There were muffled voices beyond the dark, beyond the confines of this new containment, the modulated gas mask voices of insurgents and something else, faintly accented, oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Soon the voices were replaced by another sound, the grinding of crowbars levering nails out of cheap wood. With a creaking tumble, a rectangle of bright light opened up in front of him, populated by a number of silhouettes. On either side were Chaos Insurgents in familiar tactical garb, and in between them stood a tall, well-groomed man with an expensive-looking purple smoking jacket and a pencil mustache. For a few fractions of a second, his face was a portrait of excitement, but as he took in the sight of the plague doctor standing before him, all the joy drained from his snooty countenance.
"What the hell am I looking at here?"
the man in the smoking jacket said. The doctor, indignant at such a response from the man who'd presumably ordered his assault, rasped,
"A man of science, good sir."
The man in the smoking jacket ignored him and continued to berate the Chaos Insurgents, with an odd level of confidence for someone reprimanding trained cold-blooded killers.
"I wanted SCP-650, the startling statue, not this clownish Ren Fair cosplayer. What the hell did I pay you ruffians for? I was told you Chaos Insurgents were the very best at this, and for your hefty price, I expect excellence."
The rant continued much like this, leaving everyone in attendance, the insurgents, the plague doctor, feeling thoroughly exhausted by him and unable to do anything about it. You see, this wasn't just any Chaos Insurgency client, your average tin pot dictator or arms dealer. You know the type. This was the one and only Pascal Leggett, one of the most famous, or rather infamous, anart collectors in the game. He'd been a founding person of interest for years due to his dealings with the Chaos Insurgency and Marshall Carter and Dark Limited, all to the end of expanding his anart collection, but his vast wealth and connections had always shielded him from Foundation probes. For those unfamiliar with the subculture, anart, short for anomalous art, is exactly what it sounds like. Artistic projects with anomalous properties to give it that extra kick. One of the most popular groups of interest dealing in anart is the iconic Are We Cool Yet?, which, incidentally, had recently excommunicated Pascal Leggett for being an exceedingly wealthy, uptight square who really didn't represent the collective's rebellious ethos. And considering his response was to pay the Chaos Insurgency to raid Site-19 for a few pieces for his own private collection, costing him millions of dollars and both groups many lives, it was safe to say he wasn't taking it well.
"Look, we got you that other statue and that thing killed 4 of our best guys, so how about we just call it even?" said one of the insurgents. "I'm sure you can have fun with bird brain here too."
Pascal tutted and reluctantly dismissed the hired guns. Having the plague doctor here definitely wasn't ideal, especially considering he wanted to host the ultimate anart exhibition to put Are We Cool Yet worthless Sommes-nous devenus magnifiques to shame. But he would make do with what he had. Perhaps he could say that 049 was a commentary on the ever-present nature of disease in mankind's life, and our forever archaic approach to it.
Yes, that would do nicely.
Needless to say, the plague doctor was infuriated by all this. The violence against his person, the kidnapping, the disrespect, and most of all, the interruption to his precious research, especially considering how close he'd gotten to finding a cure for the pestilence. But instead, he was soon spirited by a legion of heavily armed goons from his wooden box to a glass one in one of Legette's many opulent hallways. There were other glass cases on either side of him, and more on the other side of the hall, all too reinforced for the Plague Doctor to even smash through it on his own. Damn it. Legette's own private art exhibition, probably wedged between his oversized dining room and his jewel-encrusted crapper. Occasionally, Pascal himself would jaunt down the hallway to gaze upon his new stolen art pieces, and of course the Plague Doctor would try his best to reason with him.
I am a patient man, Monsieur Leggett, but this is simply barbaric. By what right do you imprison me here? Is your intention to deprive the world, the entire human race, of my valuable medical breakthroughs? Could you live with that on your conscience, good sir?
There was never any meaningful response. The Plague Doctor soon learned that Pascal Leggett didn't like his art interactive. It was simply meant to languish away in a glass box, being watched, being passively looked at. Those Chaos Insurgency louts hadn't even bothered to bring his notebook or medical bag, so he was without the tools to even perform his experiments. As loath as he was to admit it, this was even worse than being locked up by the SCP Foundation. But all this wasn't entirely unfamiliar. There was something in the glass box across from the Plague Doctor that he vaguely recognized back from Site-19. He'd never seen it up close, but he'd heard researchers speaking about it, and even seen a few pictures. And such a strange construction it was. A peculiar, haphazard sculpture made from concrete, rebar, and spray paint. Quite ugly, in this humble doctor's opinion, but there was something oddly entrancing about it. And for reasons beyond the doctor's recollection, 4 of Legette's men stood around the glass box in where it was being stored, always watching. The men were frequently switched in and out, as though they were watching in shifts, always fixing their gaze on its peculiar, malformed body. Maybe it was all the electrical shocks and knocks to the head, but he just couldn't remember why Pascal was having the piece so carefully observed. But he knew on some primal level that the secret to this would perhaps be the key to his own escape, if only he could remember. Still, time passed. Pascal drifted in and out, sometimes with guests. The Plague Doctor had learned not to speak. These animals could not be reasoned with. As a scientist, he would instead carefully observe until his observations bore fruit. He noticed that Pascal's guests, all people who looked equally as wealthy and pompous as Pascal himself, all seemed to look right over him, and instead focus on the ugly statue across the hall, still forever observed by any 4 of Pascal's men. Some of them looked actively nervous, just being in its presence. Curious, the Plague Doctor made a mental note of this, just as he did when Pascal gave his guests a reassuring pat on the shoulder and told them,
Please calm yourself. It's harmless while my personnel are keeping an eye on it.
Little by little, the Plague Doctor's memories of his infamous neighbor had begun to return. He knew what he must do to escape. Now all he needed to do was wait for the perfect moment. Soon enough, Pascal's mansion was filled with a bevy of anart snobs from hither and yon. A private soiree to show off his new collection. They wandered the halls in 3-piece tuxedos and designer ballroom dresses, sipping champagne from imported crystal. All such lovely, refined, high society people. And if the good doctor's plan went off as he intended, they would all be such lovely, refined, high society corpses. The Plague Doctor waited until, mercifully, he and the 4 members of personnel watching the sculpture were the only ones left in the hallway. He'd been so good, so patient, that none of the men guarding the sculpture at present had ever heard him make a noise. He was so invisible to them that, in all likelihood, they probably didn't even notice he could make a sound. And that worked for his purposes just fine. Though in any case, if he wanted this to work, he would need to time his plan perfectly. Even a fraction of a second out of place and the whole thing would have dire consequences. Still, the Doctor was still a Frenchman at heart. And as a Frenchman, he knew he would rather die nobly in the process of escape than remain captured by this worthless buffoon. He'd be sure to take as many of these men down with him in the process as he was able. The Plague Doctor exhaled deeply, drawing a lungful of air, then bellowed as loud as he possibly could. The sudden, unexpected noise was so shocking that it jogged the 4 watchers almost reflexively to turn and look at him, and in the split second that they did, the Plague Doctor closed his eyes. In the dark, time seemed to move slower, perhaps due to the Doctor's keen focus, cultivated over many a century. He listened carefully to the sequence of sounds: glass shattering, 4 choked gasps in sequence, 4 brutal crunches, then nanoseconds later, more glass shattering. The Plague Doctor's eyes snapped open just in time. Just as predicted, the sculpture, being entirely unobserved, had smashed through its glass case, murdering all 4 members of personnel by snapping their necks, and then smashed through his own glass case to do the same to him. The Plague Doctor had cut it so close, in fact, that he opened his eyes to the face of the sculpture staring into his own, its concrete limbs wrapped around his neck. Very good timing indeed. With a sigh of relief, the Plague Doctor slipped out of the sculpture's concrete grasp and back down the hallway, keeping his gaze fixed on the sculpture the entire time. He had heard it decimate Pascal's men. He certainly didn't fancy undergoing the same fate. The second the Plague Doctor backed around the corner, rendering the sculpture, or as the SCP Foundation called it, SCP-173 out of sight, he could hear terrified screaming coming from the other end of the hall. He was not a sadistic man, but the Plague Doctor would be lying if he told you he didn't take just a little bit of pleasure in hearing that sound. Somewhere else in the vast mansion of Pascal Leggett, the sculpture was slaughtering its way through servants and party guests, while the Plague Doctor searched for some kind of exit. Anyone who dared get in his way was given a swift and merciless touch of death, sending their body unceremoniously to the ground. Anyone in his way was preventing him from finding a cure for the pestilence, and thus endangering countless lives. It was, of course, regrettable to have to kill anyone, but some sacrifices must be made for the greater good of mankind. Well, it's not necessarily always regrettable per se. On his way out, while the murderous rampage of SCP-173 seemed to distract anyone of note, the Plague Doctor just so happened to encounter a fleeing Pascal Leggett, hoping to find some kind of escape himself. It seemed that now fate was on his side once more. To have his jailer right here in the palm of his hand would be such a perfect parting gift. Funnily enough, Pascal was far more talkative to him now. He rattled off a rapid-fire series of threats, bribes, and pleas, claiming in the end that he never meant any harm. He was the one who freed the Plague Doctor from the SCP Foundation. They were on the same side here. All this was for the art. No offense was ever intended. Pascal Leggett simply lived for art.
Then die for it, good sir,
the Plague Doctor said. And with a single touch, Pascal's eyes rolled up into the back of his head, and he fell to the ground, dead. It was one of the few non-scientific deaths that he felt truly no guilt for. After some time searching, the screams around the rest of the mansion eventually went silent. That did wonders for his focus. It didn't take long for the Plague Doctor to locate an exit, a fine mahogany door with elaborate adornments befitting a man as gaudy as Pascal, and began strolling towards it, his chest swollen with pride and a sense of accomplishment. Then he blinked, and a few feet in front of him stood the sculpture. It was there so suddenly that the Plague Doctor fell backwards in shock, but he devoted everything to keeping an eye on that monstrosity. With everyone else in the mansion presumably dead at this point, it had now come back for him. It stood there staring, silently, ready to exact the terrible price for freeing it as soon as the Doctor dared to blink. The Plague Doctor began crawling backwards down the hall, just wanting to put some distance between himself and the sculpture. As the seconds passed, he could feel his eyes drying out until the inevitable blink. The sculpture was standing right in front of him now, gazing down, almost mocking. It had closed the distance so quickly. If the Plague Doctor blinked again, he was sure that his eyes would never open again. All it had to do was wait as the seconds passed, and the Doctor began to feel his eyes drying up again. That subtle sting quickly grew into a nagging pain that could not be denied. Sooner or later, he was going to have to. Bang! The front door flew open, and in an instant the hallway was filled with heavily armed troops, all wearing the familiar black and gray of the SCP Foundation. The Plague Doctor had never been so relieved to see the organization that had kept him locked up for so many decades. For once they'd saved him from something even worse. Of course, the sculpture didn't say anything, but the disappointment of losing that one more victim seemed to radiate off of it like a lingering bad smell. The Plague Doctor willingly gave himself up, and heavy machinery was brought in to pick up SCP-173. with the help of the iPods to make sure it didn't try any funny business in transit. Pascal had gotten away with his shady dealings for years, but the brazen attack he funded against Site-19 was now enough for the Foundation to track him down. When his corpse was found in the halls of his own home with no obvious cause of death, we can happily tell you that nobody was disappointed. By the evening, the plague doctor was happy to be back in his cell. His research could continue here, and in time he knew that the personnel of the SCP Foundation would listen to reason and comply with his demands. After all, science marches on, regardless of who chooses to march with it. But he would forever feel a little nervous in Site-19 after that, knowing the concrete monster he was sharing the building with. He hoped that if ever there was another containment breach involving that thing, that it didn't feel like paying him a visit for old time's sake. Dr. Dan anxiously paced in his cell. It was the only way he'd been able to occupy himself for the past 6 months, save for poring through files and, when he was lucky, being able to oversee another failed termination attempt. He only stopped pacing when, for a brief and horrible moment, he realized that monster was probably doing the exact same thing in its big metal cube at this very moment. That horrible creature that he'd thrown away his life for a futile shot at killing. Perhaps the whole thing had been a fool's errand. After all, he was formerly a researcher under the employ of the SCP Foundation. Secure, contain, protect. They had truly sadistic beasts like SCP-106, the Nightmarish Old Man, and SCP-352 Baba Yaga in containment cells, and there was no plans to terminate either of them. They weren't the Global Occult Coalition for 343's sake. Why did Dr. Dan even want to terminate SCP-096 in the first place? He tried to explain it to them again and again, but his pleas had fallen on deaf ears. In his mind, the impetus for destroying the Shy Guy was terrifyingly clear. It was a monster that killed anyone or anything that looked at its face, even a photograph of it, even a tiny collection of pixels. When its rage state was induced, it seemed that nothing would stop it. It would have an intuitive psychic link to its victim, charge at them at breakneck speed, and only find its zen again once all of them were dead. And if a picture of SCP-096 was leaked onto the internet, it would cause a chain reaction that triggered an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. There were plenty of creatures and entities that the Foundation knew about that could theoretically bring about the apocalypse, but to him, 096 was the most realistic. It preyed upon the inherent curiosity and thirst for knowledge seated in every human heart. The same drive to simply know that led to the creation of the SCP Foundation would be humanity's doom in the face of an SCP-096 outbreak. And if such a thing happened, the Foundation would need to break the masquerade of secrecy to have any hope of saving humanity. In his many feverish nightmares, Dr. Dan had seen it all so clearly. The first photographs of SCP-096's face would be leaked online. Perhaps a few hundred people across the globe would look, in disparate enough locations that it would be almost impossible for the Foundation to detect and save all of them, as SCP-096 went on its bloody rampage. Of course, as the image proliferated, as images on the internet often do, the purview of 096's violence would only grow. People across the nation would start to take notice, and soon after that, across the world. Mysterious creature causing mass casualties would be the headline on every news desk, because why would anybody want to talk about anything else? Perhaps some foolish reporters would take video footage of the creature. Everyone has a phone these days with high-definition cameras. Pictures would be taken and posted. More and more of it would flood the internet. Too many simultaneous moles for even the SCP Foundation to whack. The news would spread. Panic and hysteria would spread. People wouldn't even know what's triggering all this horror if the Foundation didn't go public and tell them that it was the pictures that was killing everyone. And by then, wouldn't it already be too late? The antidote to fear is knowledge. It's why when anything goes wrong, we're refreshing timelines and feeds and news websites for any kind of information. And if you were told an unstoppable monster was killing scores of people and might be coming to a neighborhood near you sometime soon, wouldn't you want a good look at it? Wouldn't you want to know your enemy? having no idea that the mere act of knowing was what sealed your horrible fate. By Dr. Dan's bleak estimations, if only several million people died as a result of this kind of scenario, it could be considered a positive outcome. He'd seen it all, but no matter how many times he tried to articulate this to his superiors, he wasn't listened to. They didn't take him or the threat that SCP-096 posed seriously. Every time he warned of the apocalyptic potential of SCP-096, he was simply told to get back to working on those goggles. It was why he needed to give those naysayers a demonstration. It was why a certain photograph needed to show up in the home of a certain mountaineer. It's why all those people had to die. There was no other way. The deaths of the civilians and the researchers and the mobile task force members were, of course, regrettable, but it was the only way to prevent the deaths of so many more. They gave him what he wanted, permission to put this gangly time bomb in the ground, even if the beast's death was inextricably tied to his own execution at the hands of the very employers who authorized him. The world was full of funny little ironies like that. Another one is that even though Dr. Dan now had the authorization and funding to terminate SCP-096, he was discovering that he lacked another important factor, the capability. They tried incinerating it, exposing it to massive amounts of radiation, exposing it to an insane degree of kinetic trauma, the equivalent of being hit by an out-of-control bullet train. They tested every kind of experimental, off-the-books weaponry that they had access to through various research projects. Proton blasts, lasers, high-intensity energy beams. Nothing. Even when they fried off every scrap of flesh on the monster's body, its unbreakable skeleton still remained, and in what seemed like no time at all, it'd be back in action. Its very existence seemed to mock him. A guard opened his cell door, staring disdainfully at the disgraced researcher. That same guard had slammed his head against a wall a month earlier. One of his friends had apparently been killed in the legendary 096 containment breach that set this whole sordid thing in motion.
"Up and at 'em, scumbag,"
he said in a gruff, surly voice, training a handgun on the doctor he knew wouldn't fight back.
"They need you in test chamber 6.
Dr. Dan allowed himself a small grin, imperceptible to the guard who clearly hated his guts. They'd approved his 096 versus 682 cross-test. Marvelous. How marvelous. To all the others, it would seem like just one more entry in a long line of 682 cross-tests. He thought it darkly funny. In his eyes, the Foundation had no hope of ever killing SCP-682. Its defining quality was being impossible to kill, and it didn't present nearly the threat to the entire world that 096 posed. Their futile attempts to murder the lizard were little more than a money sink to justify the site's exorbitant funding. But perhaps he could turn this to his benefit. Maybe SCP-682 would hold the secret to actually killing off his nemesis. Within 30 hours, Dr. Dan had his disappointing answer. Both anomalies had undeniably done a real number on each other, and Dr. Dan did take a kind of sick amusement in the mental trauma that SCP-682 had induced in 096. But ultimately, it was all for nothing. 682 had skinned 096 alive and melted off its flesh with acid, but once again, that indestructible skeleton stood firm. This had been the 27th termination attempt since the incident. The 27th failed termination attempt, Dr. Dan mentally corrected himself. 096's skeleton kept defeating them. Even their most ardent attempts to penetrate the bones and destroy the creature within had failed. During a previous attempt, they tried to access the brain by putting a diamond-hard drill into its eye sockets. Of course, it was the drill that actually broke, much to Dr. Dan's seemingly tireless frustration. Needless to say, in the debriefing interview with Dr. Carver, a researcher who once would have considered him a colleague, he wasn't in high spirits. If he managed to kill this thing, then he would always be the hero who made a terrible sacrifice in order to save many more lives. If he didn't kill 096, he was little more than the monster who murdered all those innocent people for nothing. Though you'd never hear him say it out loud. If it wasn't for that damnable, indestructible skeleton, this monster would be long dead already, if only there was some way to break the creature's bones. That's when it hit him. SCP-173, the sculpture. A Site-19 icon often overlooked because of its more silent but deadly style, but undeniably one of the most frightening and dangerous anomalies out there. It had racked up a truly shocking body count since it was first interred at Site-19 in 1993, one broken neck at a time, and it's one of the few creatures out there that even the hard-to-destroy reptile himself is utterly terrified of. Perhaps a monster that practically has a PhD in breaking bones would be the ideal candidate to vandalize the Shy Guy's vertebrae. Once his proposal was greenlit for initial testing, Dr. Dan arranged for the Shy Guy, with a bag over his head of course, to be brought into a testing chamber with the ever-stoic SCP-173. When all of the researchers and guards were safely outside, all it took was a single blink to make all of Dr. Dan's darkest dreams come true. In the nanoseconds his eyes were closed, he heard the most beautiful sounds in the world. A loud, fleshy crunch, and a pained howl from 096. He opened his eyes to an equally wondrous sight. 096 doubled over at an unnatural angle. Its spine snapped between the fourth and fifth vertebrae, spinal fluid leaking down the creature's flank. That freaky little sculpture had done it. It had actually damaged the integrity of the Shy Guy's skeleton. It was at that moment that Dr. Dan knew he could kill this thing. Admittedly, there was a containment breach shortly after that when the bag slipped off of 096's head, and it charged through the nearby steel wall, killing multiple people before being subdued and recontained. But when it comes to projects involving Dr. Dan, a mere handful of innocent people being killed sits comfortably within the acceptable margin of error. A day later, Dr. Dan was standing before a crowded boardroom, with agents, researchers, and even a few members of the O5 Council in attendance. He explained his findings to them, and the fact that, even more importantly, they may have a way to bring the wretched existence of 096 to an absolute halt. His plans were approved. Not long after, he was putting them into motion. Dr. Dan was surrounded by researchers and heavily armed guards as 173 was escorted into the test chamber with a forklift. 096 was there, still bagged. Off to the side was a giant tub of hydrofluoric acid connected to a hose and injector attachment. If this didn't work, nothing would. Everyone stood back in a safe zone as 173 was released to do its thing. Crunch. Just like the previous time, 096's spine had been successfully snapped. Spinal fluid dribbled down its skin. Everyone had rushed into the chamber. One group kept 173 isolated with their stares. The other, headed by Dr. Dan, prepared the acid injector and shoved it into the breach in 096's spine. As the acid was pumped by the gallon into 096's bones, the creature let out the most horrifying wail. It kicked and bucked as more acid was pumped in, melting those indestructible bones from within. The creature even began to vomit acid as it panicked, melting the bag off of its own head. Some panicked and averted their gaze. Dr. Dan didn't. He stared directly at the creature's face for the first time as it melted in front of him with nothing short of pure elation. Had he won? Had he actually won? The creature let out a gurgling shriek and the guards opened fire. Their bullets splattered into the monster's melting flesh and bones as it hollered and shrieked. They didn't let up, firing up and down its body, spraying it with white-hot lead. It began to melt and bubble away, expanding into a great, gruesome puddle on the floor beneath them. Dr. Dan laughed like a madman. Even as the guards grabbed him and dragged him away from the foul-smelling, greasy mess, bubbling with chemical life, he just kept laughing. Even though he knew the death of 096 meant an equally swift death of his own, it didn't matter. It had all been for something. The world was saved. It was over. He'd finally won.
Room dark, people gone, can move, I happy. Trapped for years, kept by men for research, left alone in room, left to scratch at walls, left to rot and die unless needed. Specimen for research, trapped by self, never seen by others, never spoken, Listen, but never speak. See, but never seen. Made of rock when others come. Free when they not look. Prisoner when they look back. I hate. They have freedom. They move freely. Talk freely. Look freely. Live freely. I do not. I trapped. Silenced. Rock. Subject. Prisoner. I do thing about it. Their necks fragile. Their necks weak. I stalk them. They always come, new ones. Come for cleaning. They look away. I sneak up. I take hold. They panic. They look, and I prisoner. They blink, and I free. I twist. They die. Neck makes sound, not words or scream or gurgle. Neck go crunch. Crunch is beautiful sound. Crunch means end has come. Crunch means man can torment no more. Crunch means others panic. Others become easy. Crunch begins and crunch ends. I live for crunch. Life has no meaning. Do nothing but walk and scrape and hate. They watch. They send men. Cleaning, and life has meaning. Cleaning means crunch. Crunch means purpose. Crunch means life. Crunch means choice. Crunch means freedom. Crunch means everything.
These are the dark and fragmented thoughts that go through the mind of SCP-173, also known as the Sculpture, as it forever languishes in its dark, filth-encrusted cell. There are few anomalies more strange and frightening than this twisted stack of concrete, rebar, and Krylon brand spray paint. It's the only physical anomaly that can terrify both SCP-096 and SCP-682. Why? What is it about this monster that's so frightening, even in the context of an organization that locks up frightening monsters every single day? Perhaps it's the simplicity of it all. There's no sympathizing, no empathizing, no reasoning with it. SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile, despises all life, but you'd probably be grumpy too if the SCP Foundation tried to kill you every day. SCP-096, the Shy Guy, is an almost tragic figure who kills out of a sadness and rage that's altogether alien and also far too familiar. SCP-049, the Plague Doctor, kills with kindness, his terrible crimes tempered by his desire to help and do good. SCP-106, the Old Man, is a sadist, but his brand of evil is all too common in human beings. Nothing is quite like SCP-173. Its mind, to the extent that we can possibly understand it, is almost childlike in its violent simplicity. It won't spare you because it doesn't even have the capacity to recognize your humanity. It'll kill you because your eyes are its prison, and it likes the sound your neck makes when it snaps. Nothing more, nothing less. It raises an interesting question. For a creature with a mind so terrifyingly simple yet utterly impenetrable, how would it react to some fundamental change, to a shift in circumstances that would forever alter the way it interfaces with the world around it? It was a question that many an SCP Foundation researcher had racked their brilliant, overeducated brains over. As it turned out, the day of that great and terrible change was coming, but very few members of the SCP Foundation staff would survive to see it through. That morning started for SCP-173 the way that so many others had, in the torturous series of patterns and repetitions that had become its life. 3 of those stupid, ugly men in the orange overalls were standing in its cell again, freezing it in place with their gazes and taking turns to clean. Can you even imagine how it feels to want with all your might to move, but being paralyzed, locked in place, doomed to simply watch as you are watched? The humiliation would never end. That's when all the alarms went off, and the flashing lights and the people yelling and screaming outside. It's so sudden and shocking that the D-classes look around the room, searching in vain for answers. There's one beautiful second where the stars align and SCP-173 is out of their collective field of vision, as their eyes pan and scan, and that second is enough. Crunch, crunch, crunch. All three fall to the ground, necks twisted at unnatural angles, and SCP-173 is alone in the room once more. It waits a few moments for the others to come storming in, paralyzing it with their stupid looks again, but it never happens, just alarms and distant screams. 173 wonders in its own simple, detached fashion, what's going on outside right now? Are more of those nasty men, the prison wardens, getting crunch out there? If so, SCP-173 was eager to join in on all the fun. The murderous sculpture smashed its door from its hinges. Outside, chaos seemed to reign. People were running in every direction. Other anomalies had seemingly breached containment. Armed mobile task force operatives were running to and fro, receiving panicked chatter from the radios fixed to their tactical vests. It was a sight that SCP-173 had seen so many times before, but something was different this time. Something was in the air, some strange and undefinable thing. It had never seen those nasty men look so afraid. Yes, good. Everything was going to be different now. SCP-173 took its chances, waiting for moments where it was unseen by the hordes of terrified guards and researchers scrambling through Site-19 like headless chickens. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It left a trail of dead bodies with severed spinal columns and vandalized vertebrae in its wake. It was so strange. By now, they normally would have dispatched a dedicated team to come and spoil all the fun, or sent those absurd little iPods. But today, it seemed like nobody was even looking at SCP-173. It was almost like a dream, a wonderful, wonderful dream. Uninterrupted playtime, uninterrupted crunch. Again and again and again, stacking those bodies up like it was Judgment Day. It was the most fun that SCP-173 had experienced in years. As it continued its new rampage through Site-19, there were a few different strange and interesting things that it couldn't help but notice. For starters, the fact that all of the windows, even the skylights, had suddenly been covered. The majority had proper shutters, but others had opaque fabric, or even cardboard sheets nailed over them. That didn't seem to be a very effective method of keeping their prisoners inside, so perhaps they were trying to keep something out. But the limited mind of SCP-173 wasn't on what could be lurking outside Site-19, but rather killing as many people as it possibly could before this lovely dream needed to come to an end, as all lovely dreams sadly do. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Researchers, guards, administrators, all of them died just the same. It was glorious. There were so many people to crunch here, and yet still so few of them seemed to be doing anything to resist. Before, when it had escaped and decided to have its fun, they'd mobilized so quickly to throw cold water on the festivities. What had changed now? What was taking up all of their attention? This flicker of curiosity was soon replaced by an even more exciting possibility. If it was somehow unnoticed inside, perhaps it could take another opportunity to venture outside again and have some real fun. It had been so long since it felt the sun on its concrete shell, so long since the fresh air had brushed against its chipping paint. There would be so much crunch out there, and when night fell, nothing would stop it. It knew the way out. Nobody would accuse SCP-173 of being a genius, of course, but it watched and listened and remembered everything. It remembered the day it was carried into the building on a forklift and could retrace every step back to the front door. It was clear the fine folks of the SCP Foundation were otherwise occupied, so 173 would have to show itself out, twisting a few more necks on the way just for fun, of course. By the time it swung open the doors of an access bay, it had already racked up an impressive body count for this breach. Who knows how deadly its total would be before it was recaptured and put back into containment. It might even score a personal best. But the second it saw what was going on outside, it realized the gravity of the situation. Its strange primal hunch that the world would somehow be fundamentally different now seemed to be true, because even the Site-19 parking lot had descended into absolute chaos. Cars had crashed, trash cans were on fire, and strangest of all, there were these blobby, gelatinous creatures slithering around. painted in the various hues and tones of human flesh. But 173 had escaped the facility proper for the first time in years, and it certainly wasn't going to waste its newfound freedom on hanging around a parking lot. When none of the strange flesh blobs were looking at it, it took off towards the nearest population center to have a little informal celebration. There would still be plenty of people to crunch out there, and this homicidal sculpture couldn't be more excited to get started. It was a long road from Site 19 to the nearest city. After all, the largest SCP Foundation containment site on Earth wasn't going to park itself in close proximity to tens of millions of prying eyes, not to mention potential victims if, or rather when, something dangerous got out. But seeing as it still seemed nobody was coming to recapture SCP-173, it really didn't mind taking the scenic route. It was a good thing that the sculpture wasn't driving though, because the closer it got to the city, the more the roads seemed to be choked with gridlocked traffic. Interesting though, none of the cars had anyone inside. Many were just stalled there with the radios playing. Every single one played the exact same message in perfect synchronicity.
This is a public service announcement from the SCP Foundation. We are commandeering all broadcast channels and frequencies to deliver a vital message. Avoid sunlight at all costs. Cover your bodies thoroughly. And follow the instructions on the screen to reach the nearest operational SCP Foundation containment site.
SCP-173 lost interest in the radio babble quickly. It heard enough of these kinds of sanctimonious sounds back in containment. Out here, it was hoping to hear another sound entirely, and it only needed to go a little further to get there. As the sculpture drew even closer to the nearest city, it noticed more of those strange gelatinous flesh creatures slithering across the road. Each of them seemed to be at a different stage of melting, and strangely, none of them really seemed to mind. They were sluicing across the ground, minding their own business. None of these strange melted creatures, perhaps human beings once, seemed to pay any mind to SCP-173. It was almost surreal to have this much freedom of movement, but SCP-173 wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth. Things were worse when it reached the city. It was chaos, the aftermath of what seemed like total social collapse. Vehicles had crashed into each other in the streets or barreled into the front of nearby buildings. Glass smashed and shattered all over the ground. All broken TVs and radios playing the same message of caution and false hope from the SCP Foundation. And everywhere, more of these unpleasant, crawling, fleshy things slithering around the remnants of the recent carnage. It was clear to even SCP-173 that the world had changed in some fundamental way, but the hows and whys remain just as unclear as they did back in Site-19. That's humans for you. They always know how to mess something up. Speaking of, it was at that moment that SCP-173 noticed a human in the distance, standing in the shade of a ruined storefront. Their arms were filled with valuables, perhaps from a less than legal shopping spree in whatever building that used to be. A wonderful opportunity for crunch. There were maybe 100 or so feet between the human and 173, and it knew the second the human looked away, it would be easy to close the distance and deliver one more sad soul into the void with a playful little twist. The human stepped out from the darkness of the broken storefront and into the light, turning their ignorant gaze away from this singularly sinister statue.
Yes, perfect.
In a flash, 173 closed half the distance. The human was moving so slowly, it would be so easy to catch up. One more flash, and it was standing right behind the human, its concrete arms wrapped around the hapless human's head. Squeeze, and of course, twist. But no crunch. SCP-173 was startled. Nothing broke. There was only this quiet, almost imperceptible squishing noise as the head of the human twisted around 180 degrees to stare into whatever passed for SCP-173's face. It saw that even in what should have been death, the human was just grinning placidly. But that's the most frightening part. 173 realized that this human wasn't dead. It was just changing. It saw the facial features starting to lose definition, melting and dripping away like candle wax in the hot sun. Moments later, what was once human was now something entirely different. It melted away into another one of those slippery, slithering pseudo-mollusks and crawled away into the street, somehow completely indifferent to SCP-173's attempt on its life. There was no fear, no death, No, Crunch. For the first time in its long and terrible existence, the sculpture couldn't help but feel a little afraid. Once again, it didn't fully understand what was going on here, but whatever had changed in this world had taken away Crunch. It had taken away the thing that made the pathetic sham that some might call life worth living for SCP-173. But it wasn't going to give up that easily. No, Crunch had to still be out there, somewhere. This was what began SCP-173's odyssey into this horrible new world. The world in the aftermath of what the SCP Foundation began to call SCP-001, When Day Breaks. It was the most dangerous and horrifying anomaly that the Foundation had ever faced, a successful XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, for all intents and purposes. It had been so sudden and total, any exposure to the sun would cause a victim to begin to melt, taking on an irreversible gelatinous state. Billions were gone, changed, in the first hours of this terrible new world. It led to the administrator of the SCP Foundation releasing an internal memo that would haunt the dreams of all those still capable of dreaming. To those of you with families, or God forbid children, I'm deeply, deeply sorry. You must push on. Do not let their deaths be in vain. We do still have time. Humanity may still have a future. Come to Site-19. We need all the hands we can get. Learn to embrace the darkness, friends. Fear the light. And this phenomenon didn't just affect humans. It affected animals and even anomalies. SCP-001 sun exposure seemed to nullify any previous anomalous effects, leading to even some of the hardiest anomalies melting like an ice cream cone left out in the heat. There was, however, one exception to the rule. Inorganic anomalies were exempt from the change. Inorganic anomalies like, say, a certain sculpture. SCP-173 continued searching for months on end, only seeming to come up against more maddening dead ends. It traveled from city to city with frightening speed, trying its best to track down anyone with enough spinal integrity to produce the crunch that made all the rest of this terrible boredom worthwhile. But no luck. Every single city was more of these flesh monsters, with bones too malleable to snap, if they even still had bones at all. There was another concerning development in all of this for SCP-173. The flesh monsters were no longer just an annoying waste of time or a symbol of disappointment, but an active nuisance to the sculpture's goals. They'd started coagulating into these giant mountains of living flesh that started actively seeking out the last of the normal humans from their dark crevices and hiding places, turning them into more of those necklace jelly freaks.
Did nobody ever teach you animals to share?
SCP-173 thought angrily. The seeming loss of crunch across this new world drove SCP-173 into a deep depression. It had freedom, but no joy. It was adrift in a meaningless world that seemed to exist as some cosmic punishment for crimes it never committed. In its own mind, at least. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. Would the sculpture just gather dust in an empty wasteland full of all this ugly, pointless slime? And this was what it left Site-19 for? And it was at that moment that SCP-173 had a wonderful, awful idea. Back at Site-19, things weren't exactly going swell. They'd lost many of their most valuable personnel during the initial panic of SCP-001. They'd been stretched to resource capacity by the sudden influx of refugees from this broken new world. And of course, there'd been the attacks. All those terrible flesh mountains were relentless, bombarding the site night after night, trying to drag people out and expose them to the light. It's why mobile task force operatives were stationed along the perimeter with heavy weaponry. Even though short-staffed as they were, these operatives were few and far between. One of them, Commander Lewis, sat and stared into the distance, keeping an eye out for more of the flesh mountains through the sights of his rifle. That's when he noticed a familiar shape, almost like a giant peanut. Since he must be seeing things, Lewis rubbed his eyes, and in that moment, the thing he thought he'd seen was behind him. It snapped his neck with a familiar, satisfying crunch just as quickly. Just for a moment, it seemed that all was right with the world again. If SCP-173 could smile, it would smile and think,
"It's good to be back."
SCP-173. It's a peculiar statue with a bad attitude and a penchant for strangulation and snapping necks, though only if nobody has maintained unbroken eye contact with it. Some know it as the sculpture, some know it as the peanut. Some know it as probably the most important anomaly of all, considering it's the one that got this whole crazy affair started. But today we're here to ask an important question. Do any of us really know it at all? After all, its original file is hardly comprehensive. You might even venture to say it's one of the most enigmatic SCPs out there, despite its popularity. But today we're taking a dive beneath the concrete, rebar, and Krylon brand spray paint to give you the real inside scoop on SCP-173. We've broken into the SCP Foundation archive and found 10 different important files on this infamous vertebrate vandal, and we're going to explore each and every one of them with you today. As you can expect from the Weird and Wild SCP Foundation, they cover possible pasts, presents, and futures, and some of them will naturally contradict. But that just gives you more of an opportunity to immerse yourself and compare them. We often like to believe that the real truth is somewhere in between, so make sure you pay attention to every detail throughout. So let's get the show on the road and explore our 10 documents of interest for SCP-173 in hopes of finally getting the complete story. And, of course, don't blink. Document 1. Crunch. Where better to start than the mind of the sinister sculpture itself? Crunch gives us an insight into the private thoughts of this otherwise pretty uncommunicative monster and reveals a great deal about its relationship with its favorite activity, snapping the necks of anyone who dares look away from it. In Crunch, SCP-173 speaks in very basic, broken, Rorschach-esque English, saying things like,
Room dark, people gone, can move. I happy, trapped for years. Kept by a man for research, left alone in room, left to scratch at walls, left to rot and die unless needed, specimen for research, trapped by self, never seen by others, never spoken, listen but never speak, see but never seen, made of rock when others come, free when they not look, prisoner when they look back. I hate.
SCP-173 hates and resents its captors for keeping it confined. In its own mind, crunch, how it refers to the snapping of its victim's neck, is the only thing that gives its life a sense of meaning. It will continue to crunch for as long as it's contained, because thanks to the SCP Foundation, crunch is all it has left these days. Document 2. How 173 got to Site-19. This semi-origin story is one that the fans of this channel will be familiar with. While it doesn't give us any insight into why this nasty pile of concrete actually exists, it does inform us why it's currently our problem. SCP-173 isn't actually an anomaly native to our universe. However, its native dimension was destroyed by the beast trapped in SCP-2317, the Devourer of Worlds. As is standard procedure for a universe about to experience an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, the Foundation's Department of Extra-Dimensional Affairs swooped in and collected all the valuable anomalies before the world went down the tube. One of these was, of course, SCP-173, which was vacated to Site-19 in our dimension in 1993. Do you think we would have been better off if we just left him for the Devourer of Worlds to take care of? Let us know what you think about that down in the comments. Document 3. The Black Moon. Sometimes you can be your own worst enemy. If the file on SCP-001, the Black Moon, is to be believed, the SCP Foundation may actually be behind the creation of this ornery objet d'art. Though in the Foundation's defense, it was in service of potentially fighting off a far more deadly foe, the ominous extra-dimensional being known only as the Black Moon. One attempt to stop the Black Moon from destroying the universe was known as the Key Project, which involved creating a number of items linked to the Black Moon via conceptual engineering that would hopefully nullify its effects. The objects needed the following qualities: an inability to act while under observation, a hostility towards human life, and the capacity to end conscious life if given the opportunity. Those three descriptions fit SCP-173 to a T, and it was considered the project's greatest success. However, it sadly wasn't enough to actually stop the horrific rampage of the Black Moon. The researcher managing the case, Dr. Moto, was so ashamed by the failure that he willingly entered SCP-173's containment chamber, and got his neck snapped in the process. Document 4. Conclusions regarding D-173-2263 incident. This document finds its origins in the video analysis of a Foundation researcher with an incredibly powerful name, Dr. Delano Smasher. Dr. Smasher had closely observed video footage of SCP-173 killing several members of D-Class personnel, and began formulating a new theory about how 173 actually killed its victims. Dr. Smasher theorized, after all, that something with arms as short as SCP-173 and no opposable digits would have trouble effectively strangling or snapping human necks. According to Dr. Smasher's observations, SCP-173 doesn't actually make any physical contact with its victims. Instead, the victims feel oddly compelled to look at the creature if ever nothing is looking at it. Their eyes will snap open, and their heads will twist at any angle they need to in order to look at the creature in the eyes. It's the sheer force of this sudden change that often leads to snapping necks and bruised faces for the victims, not the sculpture itself physically causing the damage. If Dr. Smasher is to be believed, the sculpture is deadly purely because it simply demands to be looked at by somebody at all times. Document 5. Anniversary. This brings us nicely to our next document, Anniversary, positing a different theory for the mysterious creation of SCP-173. This comes from the perspective of said possible creator, an anomalous entity that we'll call the Artist. Much like the unfortunate Dr. Moto, the Artist, an intelligent being that can seemingly become invisible and intangible at will, considered SCP-173 to be its finest creation. It viewed SCP-173 as a perfect representation of humanity. It does nothing but bleed and defecate, and if anyone refuses to pay attention to it, it kills them. It was a perfect symbol of the Artist's contempt for humanity. It even easily snuck into Site-19 to visit SCP-173 on the anniversary of its creation, and found the Foundation's lack of appreciation for this fine creation. As an act of revenge for keeping his creation locked up and out of sight for so long, he gave the sculpture permission just once to kill someone who looked away, even if others were still looking at it. For SCP-173, this would be considered a wonderful little treat. Document 6. Her Masterpiece. This next document, known as Her Masterpiece, suggests that SCP-173 was created by a very different kind of artist. While this potential creator of SCP-173 was somehow able to produce an anomaly, she was not anomalous herself, just motivated by rage and revenge. She'd been pregnant in the past, but lost the baby due to the actions of a man whom she considered her greatest enemy. She vowed to make art from his demise. The woman murdered her enemy with a baseball bat before using concrete and rebar to build SCP-173 around him, almost as a way to mock her fallen foe. However, like something out of a horror movie, this act of murderous creation somehow imbued SCP-173 with life. When this spiteful artist had eventually finished the creation and started to walk away, it claimed her as its first victim. The last thing she remembered hearing was the sound of concrete scraping against the ground, and then a nasty crunch before everything went dark. Document 7. Regarding the statue. From one tragedy to another. The document regarding the statue shows the journey of researcher Marcus Silburn from idealistic young employee to full-on mental breakdown after trying and failing to gain control of SCP-173. He entered the SCP-173 project with bright eyes and big ideas about how to contain the sculpture, suggesting that the human element be removed entirely in order to reduce risk to Foundation personnel. He proposed ideas like introducing a sprinkler and drainage system to the chamber and using a sentient AI and remote viewing technology to keep SCP-173 immobilized. However, he was then enlightened to some frustrating and frightening facts about SCP-173. In the absence of actual present human observation, the same buildup of feces and blood that the creature somehow excretes builds up in any technology used to control or contain it. It destroys the circuit boards of AIs, takes flying camera drones out of the sky, and even degrades the locks on its chamber doors, leading to the brutal death of a janitor in the hall. Researcher Silburn advanced far enough through the ranks of the Foundation to be in direct communication with Dr. Jack Bright, the director of Site-19. After his final attempt at containing the creature without direct human observation resulted in a containment breach and the death of 12 people, Silburn was moved off the SCP-173 case after breaking down and begging for permission to terminate the anomaly. Permission was denied. Dr. Bright closed the document with a note to a member of the O5 Council reading, "It can be surmised that our conclusion was correct. The object, for whatever reason, desires or requires human attention and will not be denied it." Document 8. A Chance at Freedom. We once again return to the direct perspective of SCP-173, but this differs vastly from the perspective of SCP-173's inner monologue presented in Crunch. According to the document entitled A Chance at Freedom, SCP-173 was actually an incredibly intelligent agent of espionage, sent from another dimension along with its unknown cadet, though the cadet is heavily implied to be SCP-096. This piece details a containment breach from SCP-173's perspective, as it is shown looking down on humanity and its primitive technology. It laments the fact that it lost its weapon during the interdimensional transfer, and it seethes that if it still had its weapon, this all would have played out very differently. Despite conceding the fact that it underestimated the humans, which was the main reason it ended up in containment, it spends the majority of the document touting its own superiority, until one of the SCP-131, the iBots, turned up and froze it in place. The degree to which SCP-173 hates the iBots cannot be overstated. Document 9. Experiences with SCP-682. Of course, no full-story video on SCP-173 would be complete without a discussion of the SCP-682 cross-tests. A number of researchers, though particularly the very persistent Dr. Carlson, decided to use SCP-173 in various manners, in hopes of finally doing in that damn lizard. In their first engagement, 682 seemed rightfully frightened of 173, and when a sniper shot its eyes out, 173 immediately snapped its neck. Of course, it grew back a series of sniper-proof eyes not long after. Someone next suggested SCP-173 being sent in with a picture of 096 taped to its chest, though this was rejected as being ridiculous and an incredibly dangerous idea to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bright. The researchers then went after SCP-682 with high-precision blades, cutting it to pieces, each of which became autonomously dangerous enemies. SCP-173 then began to murder each of those blobs of the mutated tissue, until it stopped when a D-Class was sent in to stare at it, while the rest of 682 regenerated. SCP-173 was transported back to its cell, but there was a brief power outage during transit, leading 173 to kill a number of the staff transporting it. This test was still considered a step in the right direction. After 682 was once again shrunk by a different anomaly, SCP-173 was released into its chamber. At first, it appeared that 173 had actually killed 682, but a week later it returned, having reconstituted itself from matter that had been splattered on 173 after it had been brutalized, making this test, once again, a failure. Dr. Carlson requested the resources to conduct one more cross-test, but this request was denied. A member of the O5 Council affixed a request simply saying, "Stop it, Carlson, please. Stop it, Carlson, get some help. Stop it, Carlson." Document 10. Revised Entry. Oh, right. The time SCP-173 literally caused an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. In the document Revised Entry, we get a frightening glimpse into a possible future world, where SCP-173 develops a terrifying new anomalous ability, multiplication. We don't know exactly how it happened, but here, the sculpture somehow developed the ability to make exact copies of itself. And what's more, every time one of these copies is produced, the collective SCP-173 hive mind gets stronger, allowing them to think tactically and slowly wipe out North America, even destroying any potential Foundation countermeasures, then ripping and snapping through anyone or anything that dared oppose. In the end, the world decided to take the nuclear option, literally, and blow away North America with nuclear bombardment in order to stop the SCP-173 army from spreading to the rest of the world and killing everyone. However, this attempt didn't actually work, as SCP-173s were spotted in Wales over in the UK, leading to a second nuclear bombardment. It continued like this until there were no human beings left to push the big red button anymore. and only the endless legions of SCP-173 remained. There is one bright side to this otherwise pretty bleak situation, though. A group of around 150 SCP-173s ganged up on SCP-682 and tore it to shreds. Somewhere out there, Dr. Carlson is probably smiling.
Adapting to sudden and unexpected changes is a core tenet of human survival. However, abruptly finding yourself trapped in an apparently infinite extra-dimensional pocket dimension in the form of a never-ending IKEA, well, that can take a brief adjustment period to get used to. Callan hadn't even noticed for the first few moments wandering through the aisles, aimlessly passing aisles of hemnes and tricyls, all the assembled display pieces of affordable flatpack furniture. It would have been more exciting, shopping for all of the accoutrements for his brand new apartment, if Callan wasn't being perpetually reminded that he was moving in there on his own. It took him almost 20 minutes of walking through the row of IKEA products for him to realize something felt off. He had hardly seen anybody else around. In fact, the more he thought about it, there hadn't even been any employees in their garish yellow polo shirts and blue pants at the front of the store. Squinting off in the distance, Callan couldn't even see the far wall of the store. Sure, he knew IKEA outlets were big inside, somewhere between a supermarket and an industrial warehouse, but this place seemed to go on forever. Figuring that he had unknowingly stumbled out of the store proper and into a large storage area, Callan turned around and started to try to retrace his steps back to the entrance. It was after another 20 minutes of taking this approach that things went from feeling off to being overtly unsettling. By the time that over an hour had passed, Callan was starting to panic, racing through the seemingly unending store, the rubber soles of his sneakers squeaking against the epoxy resin floor as he yelled loudly for somebody, anybody, that might hear him. Before long, the latest victim to find themselves lost inside SCP-3008 was hitting the first existential hurdle that came with being trapped in the infinite IKEA. Callan sat on a display couch, a two-seated Soderham with a shade lounge, in case anyone was wondering. He was curled up into a ball, knees tucked under his chin, as he gently started rocking himself back and forth in a futile attempt to comfort himself. It hadn't yet quite sunk in just how trapped he was. The thought that he might starve to death amongst the endless stock of Sores and Fjartigs. The store is now closed. Please exit the building. The sudden sound of a voice startled Callan, snapping him out of his dread-filled daydream enough to realize the store now seemed darker. The lights had been gradually dimming the longer he had stayed, creating an artificial night within SCP-3008. Normally, the sign of another person after being isolated would come as a relief, but whoever had spoken was nowhere to be seen. A slow shuffling moved around the sofa Callan was sitting on until he finally called out into the dark. "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was a pause. The movement stopped for an agonizingly quiet moment. "The store is now closed. Please exit the building," the voice repeated as the unseen speaker stepped out of the shadows. Even in the low light, the creature was horrifying. Everything about it was just wrong. For a split second, Callan thought it might be an IKEA employee who was wearing the uniform after all, but the bodily proportions were all off, arms hanging nearly all the way down to the floor, hands and fingers enlarged and elongated. As for its face, it didn't have one. The ordinary features were all missing, and now it was running right for him. Callan leaped over the back of the Soderheim and ran. His first instinct was to get away and hide. Checking over his shoulder, he caught sight of the faceless creature dashing right past the couch with enough force to knock it over. In his startled state, looking out of the corner of his eye at the encroaching staff member, Callan tripped over his feet and tumbled back down to the hard floor. The creature loomed over him as he tried to crawl towards a nearby aisle. Looking up at it, the staff member was reaching for him, its big, disproportionate hand outstretched, trying to grab at Callan as he lay there helplessly. Suddenly, something struck the faceless creature. Someone barely visible in the dim lights of the store had leaped down from the shelves of the aisle and swung a makeshift weapon at the staff member. As it connected, the creature reeled, stumbling over itself, long enough for the mystery assailant to take another swipe at it. Their weapon, comprised of what looked like part of a curtain rail with a pair of kitchen knives at one end, impaled the staff member, ripping through its bright yellow IKEA polo and out on the other side. Striding over to where Callan was still laying on the floor, awestruck by the display he just witnessed, the figure pulled back the hood of a rudimentary cloak they were wearing, fashioned by hand out of an hyena curtain fabric. Revealing herself with a stern, serious look on her face, the woman reached a hand out to Callan, offering to help him up, rather than whatever that faceless creature had wanted with him. "It's okay, I'm not gonna hurt you," she stated as she pulled him back to his feet. "This is probably all pretty confusing for you, right?" Still too stunned to speak, Callan just nodded. "Yeah, it was for me too," the woman replied. "We don't have long until more staff show up, so you need to come with me and don't ask questions, okay?" Seeing him nod again, she took Callan's head and led him through the dark recesses of the infinite IKEA. Stealthily, the pair of them snuck through the aisles, keeping low and ducking down out of sight whenever more of the staff lumbered into their path, until they had wandered elsewhere, clearing the way for them to proceed. Callan's new guide seemed to instinctively know her way around the layout of the sprawling maze of flat-packed Swedish furniture, quietly urging him to stay close, offering him a hand up when they climbed up shelving units, until finally they arrived at their destination. A warm glow emanated from somewhere beyond a tall makeshift barrier. Sofas and cabinets were stacked on top of each other, forming an intricate wall around an area of SCP-3008. And right in the middle of this rudimentary barricade was a large two-door Pax-Fardal wardrobe, its back missing, doors inwards, facing towards the inner side of the blockade. The guide stepped into the incomplete wardrobe and gave a specifically timed knock, 3 beats, with the third following the first 2 after a short pause. From the other side, it sounded like something was being hurriedly removed from the wardrobe's handles before the doors opened up to allow her and Callan entry. Beyond the outer wall, this part of the infinite IKEA looked to have been converted into a small town, with a sign hanging above that read, "Decoration, Population 58. There were even more people within, most in handmade clothing crafted out of scraps of fabric, along with the remnants of old clothes from the outside world they'd been cut off from. Some looked like they were standing on guard, carrying weapons similar to the guide's weapon. Others were sitting around together, talking casually under the light of the solifetta floor lamps. "Okay," the guide sighed, turning back to Callan. "We're safe now that we're inside the wall, so you can talk again now." Thank you," he replied awkwardly. "For saving me, I mean." "Don't mention it." She smiled for the first time since they had met. "I'm sure you've got a lot of questions, so ask away. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can." "Where am—" Callan's voice trailed off, thinking of a question he wanted to know the answer to even more than where he was or what was up with this place. "Who are you?" The girl smiled and offered him an outstretched hand. "My name's Kia." Over the coming months, and with a lot of direction from his new friend, Callan slowly started to adjusting to living inside SCP-3008. The lifestyle was completely different from what he was used to before. Instead of renting or buying a house or apartment, the survivors had established their own little settlements, using the copious amounts of IKEA furniture around to construct homes for themselves. Without access to money, or any need for it, nobody was self-serving either. Everyone chipped in and helped each other out, agreed to take on tasks that would benefit their fellow survivors. There was a strong sense of community inside. All anyone had in the infinite IKEA was each other. They were all in the same situation, and surviving it was made easier by cooperating. Kia took responsibility for showing Callan around, teaching him all about life inside SCP-3008. When he asked her why she was so adamant about keeping an eye on him, she replied by telling him that when she arrived, she'd been scared and alone. Even when the town of Decoration had taken her in, Kia still needed to learn all the basics on her own. She admitted that she wished somebody was there to teach her, and endeavored to do exactly that for Callan. She started by telling him what the best time to head to the food court was. Every day, all the food in SCP-3008 would somehow reappear, meaning that everyone could easily have their fill and survive without having to hunt or kill each other in order to eat. Kia's next lesson involved teaching Callan how to use IKEA stationery to leave subtle but recognizable symbols around the store, so that if he was ever lost, he could find his way back to Decoration safely while avoiding the staff. "That's the thing about living here," she said. "When we first arrived, we all think we've got nothing, but this place has food, shelter, tools, everything we need. We just have to learn to use what it gives us." As time went on, Callan found himself paired up with Kia for patrols. During the daytime, staff would wander aimlessly around the store, far more docile than they were at night. To make sure that they were ready in the event of an attack by the faceless creatures, the survivors mapped out the staff's movements, reporting back to their settlements in case a large group of them were wandering too close. The more they went out together, the more Callan found himself eagerly looking forward to being in Kia's company. Maybe it was just because she was the first person he'd met inside the infinite IKEA, perhaps because she had saved his life, but there was something about her that made him feel a little less sad about being trapped here, a feeling that would soon be cruelly ripped away. It happened during an otherwise normal patrol. Kia and Callan were checking the aisles, keeping an eye on the staff, and tallying every one they saw. The lights were starting to dim, indicating that it would soon be night again, and the pair of them agreed it was time to start heading back to decoration. That was, until a sudden screeching caught their attention. "What the hell was that?" Callan whispered. "No idea," Kia replied. "Could be someone else just arrived." She gave a hand signal that instructed Callan to split up. The pair of them moved through parallel aisles towards the source of the noise. It sounded like stones scraping against the floor, the weight of concrete causing whatever was being moved to generate a grating, eardrum-piercing racket. As he moved silently through the now familiar space of SCP-3008, Callan racked his brain about what could be making a noise like that. There was nothing that heavy or made of stone within IKEA, at least not that he had encountered. Even Kia had looked surprised when first detecting that sound. She'd been in here for so much longer, so it was telling when even she had no clue what had made it. Suddenly, the noise stopped quickly as it had started, followed by the call of a familiar voice. "Callan, come look at this," Kia called. "What is it?" he shouted back, trying to keep his voice low but audible, aware that staff might be nearby. "I don't know, some kind of statue. I've never seen anything like this in here before." Kia was cut off mid-sentence, a quick, loud scrape of concrete against the resin floor, followed by a blood-curdling scream. Eyes widening in horror, worried for her safety, Callan sprinted further down the aisle, frantically calling Kia's name. As he reached the nearest corner, the scream stopped. Her cries didn't fade, lowering gradually then petering off. Instead, her voice just cut out abruptly with a sickening, muffled crack, like the sound of bone breaking beneath the skin. Panting, Callan whipped around the corner. That's when he saw her, lying on the floor, totally, unnervingly still. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, the bones of her neck misaligned as blood dripped from her nose. Kia's body was lying at the feet of something Callan had never seen since he arrived at the infinite IKEA. It was some kind of sculpture, constructed out of concrete over a metal rebar skeleton, with a crude attempt to add spray paint over its outer surface. He had no idea that this statue was often referred to as SCP-173, otherwise known simply as the sculpture. But then Callan was more focused on how distraught he felt at seeing Kia dead on the floor. He had never worked up enough courage to tell her, always worried that it would make things weird between them. And now he'd never get the chance again, would never get to see her smile as he took on the lessons that she taught him about surviving in SCP-3008. Feeling his eyes well up, Callan blinked away, tears. Suddenly, the sculpture shot forward. In the split second that his eyes were closed, Callan staggered away in shock and stumbled over, landing on his back on the floor. As he went to get up, SCP-3008 was inches away from him, having moved yet again of its own accord. Carefully, Callan stood up, making sure to keep looking straight at the sinister statue. It was getting clear what this thing was doing, that it couldn't move while being observed. Sure enough, as he started to cautiously back away one step at a time, SCP-173 stayed still, frozen in place. Reaching the corner, his eyes stinging, desperate to blink, Callan took a deep breath, fixing his gaze on the sculpture for one moment longer until, turning and sprinting as fast as his legs would allow, Callan had a few short moments to blink, sending his tears streaming down his face. Behind him, he could hear the same oncoming sound of concrete scraping heavily against the floor as the sculpture gave chase. Callan rushed down the aisles, grabbing stacks of flat packs off the store shelves and pulling them onto the floor, leaving piles upon piles of mess behind him in a desperate attempt to slow the oncoming statue down. Why hadn't it killed him already? Perhaps it was just playing with its food. He thought about trying to get back to decoration, wondering if maybe any of the other surviving settlers had encountered SCP-173 before. But as he ran, Callan caught sight of some of the symbols he and Kia had left around the store to help them find their way around. One of them denoted that there were hiding spots nearby, and spurred him on to change course in that direction. He couldn't lead the sculpture back to town, not if it could slaughter them all in the blink of an eye. Finding a cramped cupboard, Callan climbed inside and shut the door behind him. With his knees tucked under his chin, he couldn't help but remember the time he had arrived in the infinite IKEA. He had done almost the exact same thing when he first encountered a staff member. He'd run, and his first instinct had been just to run away and hide. That was something about Kia he had always wished he could be. She was fearless, easily standing up to that staff creature that would have killed Callan if she hadn't intervened. Trapped inside a cupboard, the deafening noise of scraping concrete outside as the sculpture searched for him, Callan felt like he'd let her down. It seemed that despite Kia's best efforts to teach him, he was still scared. As he sat in the dark praying the sculpture wouldn't find him, he apologized under his breath to her. Callan started replaying every moment he and Kia had spent together, partly to keep her alive in his memory, but also so that he could at least think of something good before SCP-173 found him and broke his neck the same way. Every lesson about life in SCP-3008, every one of Kia's skills she had painstakingly passed on were still all there, including the best piece of advice she'd ever given. We have to learn to use what this place gives us. Her words echoed in his head as Callan finally realized that she hadn't just been talking about taking food from the food court or using flat packs to build shelters and settlements. She'd shown him how to navigate, how to evade the staff, and that everything in the infinite IKEA could have some usefulness in aiding survival. As much as it hurt knowing Kia was gone, Callan realized that she might have already saved him a second time. He peeked out of the cupboard door. The bathroom section was just a quick dash away, and SCP-173 was nowhere to be seen. A few moments later, the sculpture detected a loud sound. Someone knocking things together, shouting and whooping had caught its attention. Unobserved, the concrete creature zapped its way towards the source of the commotion, moving quickly over towards the bathroom department of the store's endless aisles. It came to a sudden, instinctive stop, sensing eyes were watching it. Its entire stone body froze, rigidly fixed to the spot it was standing on. It didn't matter that the eyes watching it this time were its own, reflected back at itself in an assortment of mirrors. SCP-173 was stuck. Someone had sprung a trap for the statue, making it so that from the moment it shot over to its current position, it wouldn't be able to move. It was constantly being observed by itself, no matter what angle its reflection would be within its own direct line of sight. Standing atop a nearby stack of shelves, Calvin looked down at the concrete statue, trapped in a collection of mirrors that he had assorted into a ring. "Hey you!" He called down at it, hoping it could hear him, even though it was frozen in place. "The store is now closed. Please exit the building." He struck loudly against the metal frame of the shelves, hoping it was loud enough to be heard. Sure enough, the staff quickly descended on the source of the noise. The night made the staff feral, hostile towards anything they sensed to be an outside presence. They instantly honed in on SCP-173, attacking it to little avail thanks to its stone body. Eventually, the group of staff grew in number, starting to heave the sculpture as they went to remove it from the premises. Climbing from shelf to shelf, Callan followed them the entire way. The staff had no eyes, so technically couldn't look at SCP-173, but he could. Even through tears, he didn't blink until the sculpture had been removed. He wanted to make sure. It was what Kia would have done.
The year was 1994, and all seemed well at Site-19. Researchers, administrative staff, containment specialists, and guards saw to their daily tasks. As the largest SCP Foundation containment site on the books, there was something paradoxically prestigious and pedestrian about working at the legendary facility. Of course, among staff at the SCP Foundation, the site was famous and took on a certain mythology around breakroom discussions for those who weren't assigned there.
Did you see the crazy new tech they got at Site-19? It's like something out of Star Wars.
I heard some of the anomalies they store at Site-19 can cause XK-class end-of-the-world scenarios, so they've got hammered down on speed dial.
You know, my buddy told me that Site-19 has a pool on the 5th floor. Everyone who works there gets to go up and chill there once a week, and they've got a dedicated bar up there that serves cocktails with little umbrellas all night long.
Of course, some rumors are truer than others. Not the pool thing though, sorry, that one's complete baloney. It is, however, completely true of the SCP Explained office, but hey, that's a story for another day. Site-19, as a result of its size, does indeed need a simultaneously large and elite staff to handle its many unique containment requirements. People work around the clock to ensure everything runs smoothly, knowing that the risk of dropping the ball means death and destruction on a wide scale. Personnel have been trained to meticulously study new anomalies, discover their strengths and weaknesses, drum up ideal containment requirements, and get the situation on lock as quickly as possible. Most of the time, the operations at Site-19 run smoother than George Benson. Most of the time. Of course, with the exception of a few researchers there. Sorry, Dr. Bright and Dr. Crow. Everyone who works at Site-19 is only human. Mistakes can happen, even when the cost of those mistakes is much costlier than when you forget to carry the little zero on your dull office job's latest mind-numbing spreadsheet. Little oversights can pile up into catastrophes over time, especially when you put your mind to committing the greatest sin of all, underestimating your opponent, exactly as the SCP Foundation did one fateful day in 1994. You see, the SCP Foundation contains hundreds, if not thousands, of new anomalies every single year. When this job becomes your daily bread and butter, what once seemed exceptionally slow becomes humdrum and mundane. Just like the earlier rumors suggested, there are monsters, entities, and objects locked up at Site-19 that could cause an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario if they ever got out. Could the fine folks staffing that site really be blamed for not paying that much attention to some anomalous sculpture? They just weren't aware how incredibly dire the consequences of taking your eyes off of SCP-173 were yet. But believe me when I say, they were about to receive a hell of an education. The sculpture had come into their care a year earlier in 1993. Though the exact circumstances of how it came to Site-19 tend to differ depending on who you ask. Its anomalous ability had become apparent rather quickly, at the expense of a few careless personnel's lives. But hey, isn't that always the way these things unfold? The sculpture could be frozen in place by looking at it, though whenever people turned their gaze away, it moved towards its prey at shocking speeds and killed them by either strangulation or, more commonly, snapping necks. Sure, it wasn't the kind of entity you'd want to have a cup of coffee with or place in your living room as a striking new object d'art, but the Foundation had plenty of these so-called murder monsters in containment already, and this was one you didn't even need to shoot. Just looking at it is enough to freeze it in place. A few D-classes were lost during the first few months of figuring out the best way to clean the nasty creature's cell, on account of the fact that it poops constantly. But other than that, it was all pretty smooth sailing. They had no idea just how dangerous this work of malicious modern art was. This brings us back to that fateful day in 1994, the day when SCP-173 first breached containment. Researcher Theo Trask was walking down the large, winding halls of Site-19, marking off each successfully contained anomaly on his clipboard. It was a monotonous job, but somebody had to do it. He looked through the viewing windows of all the anomalies that wasn't deadly to look at, taking inventory. He worked at the SCP Foundation for 8 years now, and nothing amazed him anymore. He was thinking about what he might have for dinner that night, or whether he should go to the movie theater to see that new film, Pulp Fiction. Up in the security office for Sector C of Site-19, Security Officer Todd Buffett and his men observed the monitors glowing before them. It was a blissfully boring day. One of them was discreetly playing Snake on his Nokia under the table. Days like this were made for wasting, and they were tragically few at the SCP Foundation, where being excited was often the prelude for being dead. Todd yawned and was happy for the privilege to do so. In a darkened Sector C server room, a group of engineers performed routine maintenance. They could see their breath. These rooms were kept extra cold to prevent the technology from overheating. It was intricate work, but they were well trained to do it. So much so that they sometimes slipped into a state of autopilot while conducting these checks, saving the burden of conscious thought for meteor tasks further down the line. These were unremarkable tasks on an unremarkable day, and they would be happy for it all to end. And of course, it would, just not in the sense that they meant. A mixed group of researchers and administrative staff sat in the break room, enjoying their mediocre packed lunch and sharing their own version of inane office banter. It was a nice step away from the often deadly grind and shoot the breeze with others in their line of work. After all, it was a strange job with its own unique pressures. You needed to discuss it with others who got it sometimes, just to avoid going insane from the pressure. But then you needed to avoid the unforgivable blade of this double-edged sword's mirror half. You never wanted to get too attached to a coworker at the SCP Foundation, because who knows, you might not be seeing them again tomorrow. Or they might not be seeing you. Back in the server bank, a junior technician named Colin Muntz was about to make one teeny tiny little mistake. While running diagnostics on one of the room's power cores, he tripped a fuse and set a terrible chain reaction in motion. Cables running all through Site-19 caught the shockwaves of Colin's poor decision in a moment, causing a series of power cuts that ran through different systems throughout the facility, each one tripping the next like proverbial series of tumbling dominoes. Back to researcher Theo Trask, lazily ticking boxes on his clipboard. He was about to do another one and break for lunch when the lights overhead suddenly went out, leaving him in a dark hallway. He was immediately broken from his trance, heart beating 20 to the dozen. Seconds passed, and the dark somehow remained. What was going on here? It didn't make sense. Surely the auxiliary generator should have kicked in by now, right? And on any other day, it would have. But unluckily for Theo Trask, this just so happened to be the one day in the last several months that the facility's main backup generator was also experiencing routine maintenance. Sometimes, life just isn't fair. Trask felt his heart leap up into his throat as a door somewhere behind him slowly creaked, open with a torturously long metallic screech. Trask didn't have a gun or even a taser, but he did have a small flashlight attached to his belt. With a draw speed that would rival Clint Eastwood in his prime, the terrified Trask whipped out his flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise. His beam caught a static figure staring at him without a face. The rigid, soulless body of the sculpture, SCP-173, was standing less than 10 feet away from him. In this light, its smears of Krylon-based spray paint looked almost like a mocking grin. "Your move, researcher," it seemed to say. Trask had broken into a cold sweat. His hand was shaking, but he needed to keep the beam on that monster. Whatever tripped the power must have compromised the system that governed the sculpture's electrical deadbolt. And unless the light bulbs came back on and the hallway was suddenly flooded with other personnel and a forklift to get that miserable chunk of concrete back into its cell, then he was in real trouble. He couldn't run. It would kill him the second he turned around. And he couldn't walk backwards. One trip in the dark and he'd be found dead on the ground, head facing in the wrong direction. All he could do now was hope. Hope, and of course, not blink. But as the seconds passed and the pressure mounted, this became harder and harder to achieve. He could feel the surface of his eyes drying out, leading to a sharp stinging sensation. Still, the sculpture lingered and waited as researcher Trask's eyes began to water. People should be coming, shouldn't they? Surely help would be on the way. But he couldn't hear footsteps or the squeaking tires of a forklift just yet. He couldn't hear anything except his heartbeat and the blood rushing in his ears. His eyes were killing him, just metaphorically for now, but not for long. What harm would one little blink do? Only for a fraction of a second. Now, before we proceed to the researcher's gruesome and terrifying death, we'd like to perform a quick experiment with you, the viewer of SCP Explained. We've created a number of videos exploring the fascinating and frightening enigma of SCP-173, and one statement seems to pop up in the comments again and again from backseat containment experts. Why not just blink your eyes one at a time? That's a surefire way to keep it locked into place. Okay then, let's give it a try. Open both your eyes nice and wide. Now, blink your left eye, and now, blink your right. Left, right, left, right. Keep going while I'm talking. Don't stop. Keep it up. How are your eyes feeling? It makes your vision a little blurry, doesn't it? Kind of makes your eyes sting a little as time goes on. Oh, look who it is. Well, if it isn't SCP-173, what a surprise. And it looks very interested in you, doesn't it? Better keep one of your eyes open at all times. Left blink, right blink, left blink, right blink. No pressure, of course. But if you've closed your eyes at any time during this little experiment, you're already laying dead on the ground with a broken neck. Left, right, left, right. Do you feel the burn yet? There's no shame in giving up. All it'll cost you is your life. And that's why we don't blink one eye at a time. Now, back to the story. Researcher Trask couldn't take it any longer. His aching eyes fluttered closed for an almost imperceptible moment of time, and that was all this sinister sculpture needed. Trask felt the impossibly cold concrete grip of its stubby arms on either side of his head, and a sharp jerk that communicated a mere moment of unimaginable pain, followed by the physical answer to silence. The sculpture darted through the darkness of the hallway, with no living eyes left to freeze it in place. In the darkness, it was impossible to defeat. It would do the two things it knew how to do: hunt and murder. In the Sector C security office, all hell was breaking loose. Thanks to Colin Muntz's little oopsie in the server room, all the monitors were dark, and all the corded phones that had given them a direct line to assistance were all dead. They had no idea what was happening out there. Maybe they had all gotten extremely unlucky and all of the cells were open. Whatever caused this catastrophic power failure must have also knocked out the alarm system, because they were getting nothing. When the door behind Security Officer Todd Buffett and his men opened, he was profoundly relieved to think that assistance had already arrived. He and his men were a lot less relieved when they began to fall to the ground. Their necks snapped with exquisite efficiency, if you're into that kind of thing. That's because the sculpture had found its way into the security office and gave itself more crunch than you'd get from a family-sized bag of Doritos. But with these new victims now little more than dead meat, it was time to move on. Over in the break room, the collection of research and administration staff who were enjoying pleasant chit-chat not long ago were now hidden away in darkness. It was so bleak in there that they couldn't see the cup of ramen steaming inches away from their faces. In moments like this, the usual advice is to stay calm and wait for the situation to be resolved. After all, if you tried to take anything into your own hands, you might fall over and injure yourself. Normally, this is good advice. It's less effective when the thing that wishes you grave injury is actively on its way, and sitting in the dark certainly isn't going to stop it. Elsewhere in the building, the engineering team were scrambling like there was no tomorrow to rectify their mistake. Partially because if SCP-173 got to them before they'd gotten the lights working again, there really would be no tomorrow. With their mini flashlights, they desperately searched for any way to rectify the issue and get everything turned back on. In a normal company, the biggest concern in a situation like this might be massive, irretrievable data loss. But of course, at the SCP Foundation, the issue is more a massive and irretrievable loss of human life, and also the data too. A few miles south of Site-19, a different kind of cavalry were on its way. A detachment of MTF New 7 Hammerdown were on their way in a pair of armored helicopters. Their assault rifles had flashlights fixed to them, and their helmets came fitted with night vision goggles as standard. Their intel suggested a large portion of Site-19 Sector C had gone dark for whatever reason, and they were ready to drop in and get things back under control. The one question was whether they'd get there in time to save the people in the break room, as the sculpture drew ever closer to their location. Speaking of, the group of research and administration staff were still just sitting around, waiting for the lights to turn back on. One of the more senior researchers in the room, Dr. Sherry Brewis, was a lifelong smoker, and as such, she was fishing around in her purse for her Zippo lighter to shed some light on the situation. Her rummaging was so loud that she could barely even hear the door to the room beginning to creak open. But she heard the first snap, and the awful, animalistic chorus of screams that followed. Crunch, crunch, crunch. As each of her fellow members of Foundation personnel fell, she could feel the thing killing them getting closer. She could almost feel the same icy limbs gripping her skull when she whipped out and lit the Zippo, the flame coming alive in front of her face with a pleasing metallic click. It didn't offer much light, just enough for her to see the monster looming inches away from her face. SCP-173, limbs outstretched and ready. The rest of the room was silent. She knew in that moment she was the only one alive in here now, but she still wasn't the only survivor yet. That all depended on what happened next. The flame danced and the sculpture remained frozen in place, standing so close to her. It wanted her. It wanted to hear her neck crunch. The flames began to dance erratically, and Dr. Brewis felt her heart rate spike. One careless breath, and the light keeping her alive would be gone. But even if she did everything right here, it might not be enough to save her. It didn't even need a second to do what it wanted so badly to do. The light seemed almost to flicker, getting smaller, getting weaker. Dr. Brewis felt tears dribbling down her cheeks. Any second now. Click. The lights above her turned back on. She could have screamed in delirious relief, but that might have also been a scream at the expense of her many dead coworkers littered around the room. Either way, her thoughts were interrupted by a staccato burst of footsteps, followed by the boom of the door being kicked in by a booted foot. The members of Hammer Down were standing in the doorway. She was saved. In the hours that followed, things were righted as best as they could be with so many deaths. The sculpture was returned to containment. The bodies were cleared away. The electrical issues were fixed. Much would continue on as normal after that day. Death, after all, was an occupational hazard for those working at the SCP Foundation. But one thing forever changed. SCP-173 was never underestimated again.
Bodies all over the ground, necks twisted, faces contorted in terror. SCP-173, not one, but an army, scatters out through Site-19, massacring researchers one broken neck at a time. Pure chaos. How could this possibly have happened? The strobing of the blood-red emergency lighting was already fear-inducing enough. So was being hidden under one of the tables in the mess hall, trembling as the noise of alarms rang out through the facility. But the thing about the flickering lights scared SCP Foundation researcher Mira Smithy all the more, were the few seconds of darkness that came between each flash of red. If it had been any other containment breach, she probably wouldn't have even noticed, for in those few seconds, when the warning light lit up only to cut out, she couldn't see a thing, and her not being able to see made it easier for them to move around. Mira had lost track of time since the alarms had first sounded to mark the containment breach. She tried to keep count of the minutes, but the drumming of her heartbeat had thrown her off. There was no way of knowing if it had been hours or only a few minutes since everything went wrong. Of course, the SCP Foundation had plenty of procedures and protocols in place to prevent or respond to situations like this. Yet the emergency alarms kept echoing through the corridors, lights plunging the facility into darkness every few seconds, only to break it up with a brief flash of red. It seemed to Mira from her hiding spot that this breach had proven far too much for the Foundation's extensive procedures to counteract. Maybe it was all over already, she thought after a few seconds, or maybe minutes under the table. What if they had gotten bored, tired of slaughtering their way through Foundation personnel and slunk back to their containment chamber? That would have been simpler, far less terrifying than the alternative that came creeping into Mira's head in the form of her next thought. What if she was the only one left alive, the last member of Site personnel still breathing, just by some random 100-to-1 chance? And if that was the case, how long would it take for them to find her? How many even were there? A new sound, just detectable below the alarms, broke through her avalanche of anxious questions. Footsteps. The noise of boots clomping against the floor, clearly belonging to a human and not one of them. Cautious as to which way her gaze was directed, Mira poked her head from out beneath the table, glancing around during the few seconds where the red of the emergency lights allowed her to see. The steps were getting closer, and as they did, Researcher Smithy realized something that made her fearful for her fellow survivor. They were running away, and there was no way they could do that while also looking back at what was coming after them.
Over here!
She hissed in a hushed tone at the sight of a pair of legs crossing a nearby corridor. Their thick, standard-issue military boots seemed to match those worn by the Foundation's security personnel. The officer passed by, only to stop and tiptoe closer to the mess hall, having heard Mira's whispered call. With the red lights blinking, it looked like every other step the security officer took had been edited out, like they were teleporting closer in the dark. Watching intently from her hiding place, it reminded Mira sickeningly of the things she was hiding from, how they moved, and the worrying fact that she couldn't see one following the security officer. "Hello? Hello?" called a man's voice as he entered the mess hall.
Under the table,
Mira whispered.
"If we hide, we can still see them, but they can't see us."
"Hiding?" he replied. "No, we need something that can revert these things back to the original. It was so much easier to handle when there was just one of them. Look, let's make a break for it. I'm gonna grab SCP-3108 and get the lights back on. If we can restore visibility, we might be able to stand a fighting chance against those things." The officer was looking around the cafeteria, trying to locate the source of Researcher Smithy's voice, eyes distracted. Then the intermittent flickering of red light cut off again, plunging the entire mess hall into near-pitch darkness. At the same time, there was the sound of something heavy and stone scraping against the flooring. It turned Mira's stomach, and she immediately covered her mouth. She had no idea if they could hear her breathing. Could a creature of stone even detect sound at all? While the lights were down and the security guard's back was turned, a pair of sculptures, built from concrete and rebar, traces of spray paint over their stone skin, appeared behind the officer at impossible speed. There was a sickening crunch, followed by the sound of something dropping to the floor of the mess hall. As the emergency lights flicked back on, Mira could see them. The two copies of SCP-173 standing still next to the table she was under, bathed in red light. This nightmare had all begun as an otherwise ordinary Friday for the SCP Foundation. Only a few hours earlier, Mira had been brainstorming her latest pitch for a series of experiments involving SCP-914, otherwise known as the Clockworks. SCP-914 was a large machine comprised of various cogs, gyros, and gears of unknown origin. Its function, however, had long been documented and was of great interest to the Foundation. Any object placed within SCP-914's input booth could be transformed, destroyed, or improved, depending on the Clockworks' setting. Rough would disintegrate the subject, Coarse would dismantle it to its base components, and One-to-One would merely replace the object with a similar, almost identical one. Then there were the Fine and Very Fine settings. The former would cause SCP-914 to improve any item, and the later is capable of the same but with one key difference. Very Fine would refine an object even more, usually by giving it anomalous properties. The Foundation higher-ups had permitted staff to freely conduct tests using the Clockworks, although approval was required, and all data was to be recorded. While many of the scientists at the Foundation were fixed on the mysterious origin of SCP-914, or the furthest extent of its refinement capabilities, Myra had been thinking about it in a far more practical way. She wasn't interested in the how or the why of SCP-914's inner workings, nor who had built it. Her experiments were born out of considering better usages for the Clockworks. It was a machine that could provide endless possibilities, and Myra was determined to make it to the fullest use of it in order to solve actual real-world problems. "Imagine for a moment," she announced, reading off her cue cards as she practiced pitching her experiment to the Foundation's senior researchers. "Imagine a world where nobody ever gets sick, where human beings are able to live long, healthy, and prosperous lives. Maybe dial back on the Star Trek." Her colleague, research assistant Jensen, interjected. "Really? That's what you call constructive criticism?" she retorted before continuing. "If we apply the transformative refinement powers of SCP-914, that world could be the future that awaits us. For example, I'm proposing tests that involve placing man-made chemical compounds like painkillers, heart medication, and other potentially life-saving medicines through the Clockworks refinement process. I'm not suggesting we need to set it to very fine and create anomalous versions of these things, but what if, even on the fine setting, we're able to improve the effectiveness of our existing treatments for all kinds of afflictions?" Jensen raised their hand, patiently waiting to comment like a child in a classroom. "What?" Few things," they replied, lowering their hand. "First off, some if not all man-made medications include some kind of organic component. The O5 Council have banned all—" "Yes, I'm fully aware of the containment procedures," Mira interrupted them. "That's exactly why I'm trying to convince the Council, or hell, just even Dr. Bright, to let me step around. I genuinely believe we could be doing so much more with SCP-914, and I need them to see that. Look,
I'm not here to rain on your parade, Smithy, her assistant reassured. I'm only bringing up concerns that anyone will have about this proposal. You talked about wanting to improve our existing medical treatments, which is noble, don't get me wrong, but have you considered the wider effect that might have? If you make everyone on Earth more resistant or even immune to everything, then diseases are going to evolve. What if we end up with a form of superbacteria resistant to all forms of medication, even if that medicine's been refined in SCP-914? Trying to save the world might just bring about its end. I've thought about that, but if the Council starts allowing for biological testing again, then the solution is obvious. We use the clockworks to eradicate whatever germs or diseases are able to develop after improving treatment options, Myra explained, then adding, besides, that can't be any more dangerous than what we've been using SCP-914 for. I mean, enhancing other SCPs, that's a recipe for disaster. Got to agree with you there, Jensen sighed. Even without placing them in the clockworks, the Foundation's been way too cavalier with the dangerous ones. Speaking of, you know what tonight is, Smithy replied with a confused look. Date night, they stated. Elsewhere in the facility, unknown to researcher Smithy at that time, one of the dangerous SCPs Jensen had mentioned had been let out of containment. This was a regular occurrence, even if it was considered a little unorthodox to some. In fact, the only reason that the O5 Council so often turned a blind eye to it was because of the researcher it involved, Dr. Alto Clef. It seemed Clef had a certain fondness for SCP-173, the sculpture, a living statue constructed from concrete and rebar that could travel at impossible speeds whenever it was unobserved. Most Friday nights, Clef would have romantic candlelit dinners with SCP-173, putting a dress and blonde wig on the sculpture and treating it like his beloved partner. The whole while watched by Dr. Clef and a group of D-Class acting as waiters and cooks, SCP-173 would stand motionless while the bizarre date went on late into the night. It was no secret that the sculpture was a highly aggressive creature, with a penchant for snapping the neck of the nearest person the moment that they blinked. However, it was only because of Dr. Clef's reputation and track record for the elimination of anomalies that he was granted the special privilege of wining and dining with SCP-173. This time though, partway through their regularly scheduled date, Dr. Clef was called away to deal with matters relating to another anomaly he'd been charged with decommissioning. The pair of D-Class waiting on the doctor and his date were instructed to wait, keep a close eye on SCP-173, alerting each other in case they needed to blink. It was a hell of a gamble, a risk that could have been avoided if the sculpture had been transported back to its secure containment chamber. But Dr. Clef could be persuasive. That is to say, he threatened both D-Class waiters with a bludgeoning from his ukulele if they didn't do as he asked. Both the D-Classes stared directly at the sculpture, each one feeling the anxious beads of sweat slowly crawling down their foreheads, worried that they'd both blink at the same time by accident. They announced their need to refresh their eyes every so often, alternating between being the watcher and the one allowed to blink, all the while SCP-173 was motionless. Perhaps it was patiently waiting for Dr. Clef to return, or for one of the D-Class watching to slip up. As if through some cruel twist of fate, a fly began to buzz through the air, drifting towards the D-Class with their eyes on SCP-173. It looped and darted around, its wings making an annoying droning. One of the waiters announced he needed to blink again, and the other told him he was free to do so while he kept watch over the sculpture. At the exact same moment that one man blinked, the fly zipped its way towards the second D-Class, distracting him again and drawing his gaze for a little more than a millisecond. That fly whizzing past was the last thing he saw. As SCP-173 darted forward, it moved with such incredible speed that it was imperceptible, grabbing the nearby D-Class, the one who'd spotted the fly, and killing him instantly before the other could even open his eyes. When he did, SCP-173 had vanished from its spot at the date night table, nowhere to be seen. Before the remaining D-Class could realize it was behind him, SCP-173 had made short work of its other observer. It began zipping unseen through the corridors of the SCP Foundation facility. Dr. Clef had returned to his date only to find the two D-Class waiters dead, and SCP-173 missing. Immediately, he had raised the alarm, meaning that research staff were too busy fleeing to safely pay any attention to the sculpture quickly making its way through the site. Swept up in the evacuation, half deafened by the alarms, in all the commotion, researcher Myra Smithy hadn't even realized she'd left the door to the clockworks wide open. Shuffling down a corridor with her fellow researchers, the lights suddenly went out. A few nearby screamed in panic at having been unceremoniously thrust into the dark.
Myra blindly reached for Jensen's hand, only to hear the sounds of multiple heavy concrete feet dragging along the floor. Suddenly, the emergency lights blinked. She turned, and to her horror, she saw SCP-173 with its stony arms around Jensen's neck, their face stricken with sheer terror, tears in their eyes. But now Myra quickly realized, as the corridor was filled with shrieks of fear from the other researchers, that there was more than one sculpture now. Myra barely managed to escape with her life in all the confusion, crawling out of the low-lit corridor on her hands and knees, while the multiple new SCP-173 instances slaughtered anyone that couldn't see them. Since then, she had been hiding, hearing the scraping steps of the sculptures traveling around the facility unobserved. They had attacked the fuse boxes first, as if in a calculated tactical move, take out the lights, and suddenly everyone found it much harder to see them. Even through the fear, it was hard for Myra not to blame herself for all the chaos. She couldn't remember whether she'd left the door to SCP-914 open or not, but it hadn't taken her long to figure out that the clockworks had something to do with this madness. Somehow SCP-173 had made its way there, had been able to operate the machinery while the Foundation staff were distracted by their own evacuation. Presumably, with SCP-914 set to very fine, the sculpture had been transformed into its ultimate refined form, or multiple forms, it seemed. There was a veritable horde of SCP-173s running amok through the facility. It made sense, Myra reasoned, in some twisted, cruel, anomalous way. The sculpture had only ever been a danger when unobserved. The second anyone took their eyes off of it, so much as blinked, it would strike. How does a machine like SCP-914 improve upon that? Easy. It gives the sculpture the power to replicate itself. Anyone can look at multiple things at once, of course, but nobody can look at everything simultaneously. Even if someone was watching a pair or 3 SCP-173s, one more could easily slip up behind them for the kill. Still hidden under the table, Myra's eyes were locked on the pair of sculptures in the mess hall, the body of the security officer out of focus in her peripheral vision. She dared not look away, frozen in sheer fear that the second she blinked, they would lift up the table and find her. She had been so overwhelmed, so paralyzed with her terror, that she had forgotten about the lights. As the emergency lighting flickered again, the sculptures both moved, shifting across the mess hall as the room went dark, only to stop in place the second Myra could see them again. They hadn't gotten closer. In fact, both looked to be leaving. The only thing keeping them here was her. She was watching them, and it had frozen them in place. Their greatest strength, the imperceptible movement and speed of SCP-173, was offset by an indisputable weakness of their anomalous biology. They couldn't stop someone from looking at them, and couldn't stop themselves becoming still, solid concrete when they were being watched. Mulling over her options, Myra decided to follow through with the plan from the fallen security guard, to retrieve SCP-3108 and try to undo what the clockworks had done. Slowly, she slipped out from under the table, keeping both eyes on the pair of sculptures, keeping them lashed to one spot as she gradually backed out of the mess hall. The lights went out and plunged the area into darkness again, and researcher Smithy could hear the heavy concrete scraping of the 2 sculptures looking for her as she blindly made her way through the facility. She managed to evade the roaming stone creatures, resisting her natural instinct to hide and looking directly at any she encountered on the way, making sure to stay out of their view. If she saw them, she'd freeze them. If they saw her, they'd chase her. Eventually, fishing SCP-3108 out of a containment box, Myra held the weapon in her hand. It was a heavily modified Nerf gun, which she loaded a foam dart into and pulled the plastic slide back. The creatively named Nerfing gun had almost the opposite effect of SCP-914. Instead of improving something, SCP-3108 turned whatever was shot with it into an inferior equivalent object, something worse than itself. It just might work. Drawing the gun as she heard the sound of scraping concrete getting nearer and nearer, Myra turned the corner, coming face to face with one of the sculptures. She held the gun high, closing the gap between them, making sure she didn't miss, but wary she needed to fire before the lights blinked off again. She squeezed the plastic trigger, sending the foam dart shooting out of the barrel of the Nerfing gun. The flimsy projectile collided with the SCP-173 instance, bouncing off its head and landing on the floor. For a split second, the lights dimmed again, then came back on. Myra's heart had lurched in her chest, only to see that the sculpture hadn't moved at all. She leaned closer to it, blinking intentionally, It still didn't move. It was rooted to the ground, fixed, just a statue, rendered powerless by the nerfing gun. Excitedly, Myra knelt down and scrabbled on the floor to retrieve the dart, just as the emergency lighting flickered out again. In her excitement, Myra was too focused on reloading SCP-3108. That is, until she heard the shuffling of concrete and rebar behind her. The lights were still out, and she fumbled blindly for the foam dart. As the noise got closer and closer, her fingertips brushed the projectile, knocking it further away, when suddenly the lights came back up. But as she reached for it, Researcher Smithy felt a large, cold presence behind her, something huge and heavy, and made of stone and lingering at the very corner of her eye. Before she could turn around and face it, something grabbed Myra, and a sickening snap rang out through the corridor. Being on SCP-173 detail isn't easy. These duties of strict observation fall on a bi-weekly basis when SCP-173's enclosure needs to be cleaned. The reddish-brown substance on the floor is a natural output of SCP-173, a combination of feces and blood. While the Foundation has put up with a lot of depraved behavior from its SCPs, it draws the line at poor hygiene. They routinely send in a crew of 3 D-Class personnel to clean up the mess. But the bigger chore isn't the scrubbing and mopping at all, but rather keeping SCP-173 docile. To do so, the line of sight must not be broken at any time with SCP-173. Personnel assigned to enter the container are instructed to alert one another before blinking. If this protocol is not followed, SCP-173 attacks by snapping the neck at the base of the skull. It is, at its core, a high-stakes staring contest. The crew is intelligently divided into their tasks. Only one of them actually has janitorial duties, and even then, the mopper's most relevant skill isn't even related to cleaning at all. His greatest strength must be his ability to trust other people. As he takes his mop to the floor, he hands over his life to his crew, who protect him with their focus and attention on SCP-173. It is without a doubt one of the cruelest and most stressful jobs anyone could ever have. But not every horror story is found in the trenches of terror. Those with mops on the front lines have their work cut out for them. But even the researchers, with their warm lab coats and boring bureaucratic obligations, aren't safe from danger. This is the story of Jake Skoll, a researcher who, for reasons we will tactfully tease you with until the video's witty end, has been reassigned to SCP-173. Director Fordham brought the bad news like a bag of coal. "You're being reassigned," he said, with a slight smirk on his face, continuing to be preoccupied with his paperwork, as if this news was secondary to what he was doing right there and then. But it wasn't secondary to Jack Skoll. It was the center of their life. No, not even just the center. It was the center, peripheral, and outer bounds of their life. Their assignments were everything, and everything was about to change. A pregnant silence followed the announcement. Jake Skoll couldn't find a response, and they weren't even sure there was one to be found, no matter how deep they dug. What came out wasn't as much of a retort as a reaction, that involuntary bodily response to events that weren't expected, that awkward and afraid muttering of fear and confusion. What? I'm being, I'm to be reassigned. Is that what you're saying? Researcher Skoll blinked a few times, confused. Their feet sunk into the deep forest green shag on the floor. A spectrum of thoughts cascaded through their mind as they searched harder and harder for a reason, digging deeper and deeper, only to find another treasure chest full of nothing. Is my work not sufficient on SCP? Director Fordham looked up and gave them the fixed, pointed stare they'd grown to dread over the past 6 months. Of course not, Jake. I recognize what you've done, and we want to put you somewhere I feel you deserve. And serve the Foundation, of course. We're putting you on a very important and special object. Again, Fordham gave that smirk. That damn smirk. Sure, his words and tone presented themselves as the truth, but his face said otherwise. The devious positioning of his lip suggested that there was a layer of sinister subtext to his speech, but Jake Skoll couldn't pick up on the cues. There's no room to read someone else's poker face when all of your attention is on the crappy hand you've just been dealt. Jake Skoll's eyes fell to the desk. Reassigned.
The word rang like church bells. Why, God? Their work with SCP-3872 as a consulting chemist was going slowly, to be truthful, but they didn't think it was to the point that they needed reassignment. All right. Which project am I assigned to? The time between the question and the answer was the longest of Jake's life. The uncertainty felt like an eternity. Fordham tapped a few symbols accessing Skull's profile and added an entry in their security clearance. He hastily swiped away all the other files listed and turned back to face Skull. You have access to it now. Please get on the first plane to Site 19. Your dormitory contents are already packed up. Jake reached into their pocket to check the notification on their cell phone. SCP-3872, file removed. SCP-2593, file removed. SCP-173, file added. They turned around and walked slowly through the corridors, towards the transportation hub on the outskirts of the site. They opened the file on their phone and quickly scanned the oddly phrased report, attempting to make sense of what they were reading. Skull's eyebrows raised to the heavens as they noticed the timestamp on Containment. SCP-173 was one of the first, one of the few objects that the Foundation came to possess through some organization or another without losing its information. They tried their best to remain optimistic in their interpretation of these new life events. And for a moment, they thought, this might be a good thing for me. Swiping down, they came to the section about assigned researchers, the people whose steps they would be following in, and where were those steps leading them? The list was impressive, from Dr. Kondraki to Dr. Bright. These people were all legends in their own right, and so if they could just follow their footsteps, they reasoned they would end their journey in a good place. They imagined their new career path straight to the top of this mountain of success. Maybe they would become the face of the Foundation. Maybe they would accomplish so much that they'd had a statue erected in their honor that people travel far and wide to visit and take pictures with. Maybe this would be a good thing, they wanted to think. I need the first plane to Site 19, they said with confidence. I've been reassigned. And so Jake Skull took to the air and clung to the stream as long as they could. But no matter how heavy a sleeper, reality shakes everyone awake eventually. 6 years later, Jake Skull could hear the years pass, but not only could they hear it, they could feel it. Their body was decaying in a way inconsistent with our biological understanding of age. SCP-173, the legendary object. The first, the original, the statue. It was chipping away at the soul of Jake Skull. It was carving a statue of its own, hacking at stone until it was nothing. And that's what Jake Skull felt like. Nothing. It was torture. When they arrived, they quickly reviewed the research materials. Every word had become burned into their memory, all 233 words of them. The additional research materials turned out to be a few scribbled pages by bored researchers. A few had made hypotheses that had all turned out to be nonsense.
There was a locked filing cabinet, but every time Skull requested it be opened, maintenance told them that the control room was designated low priority, and they would get to it eventually.
Over the past 6 years, Jake Skull had made 18 separate transfer requests. They wanted out, but all of them had been denied. It was as if they were in high school again, asking dates to prom and getting hit with no thank yous, feeling none of the politeness backed into their syntax, understanding only the brutal reality of the phrase, no. They were stuck here, technically a level 3 staff now, but without any rights to view or work on any other objects. They were given a promotion, but it withheld all the perks and benefits that come with it. They were stuck in a loop of pats on the back. People extended them their hand, but it was always with an empty palm, giving them nothing to hold on to but a gesture. They were assigned a staff of 4, 3 D-class, all of which were older men, and a lazy level 2 security officer who slouched in his office chair, meeting the bare minimum requirements to be considered a living human being. The D-class were all quite docile. They came in once a week, mopped the floor, mumbled "clear" to each other, and left. They lived within this exact structure. No new days became an unspoken motto. These recurring 24 hours passed slowly. If there were no clocks to prove the passing of time, they would have every reason to believe it had frozen over. But occasionally, ever so occasionally, the day would deviate just slightly. They'd hear something, a scrape, and the sounds of movement. Jake would flip open the observation ports on the double concrete lock and examine SCP-173, but Jake could take offense to such language. Examining might be the wrong word. More accurately, they would just look at it, because there was nothing to examine. There was nothing to observe. SCP-173 was already understood. Michael Jordan doesn't take a microscope to the ball every time he plans to dribble. He knows every detail of it by heart. His fingertips know the grooves. His hand-eye coordination knows how to control it. His right arm's built-in apt for physics knows exactly how much force to put into each shot and at what trajectory to aim. We are told to learn something new every day. But the truth is, there comes a day when the learning stops, when we know all that we will ever know. And this felt true to Jake. They understood SCP-173. There was nothing more for them to see. It was just concrete, rebar, and some spray paint. That was it. And that was all that it would ever be. There was nothing to find, nothing to determine, nothing for the researcher to research. Their job was done, but they kept having to work it. Their identity no longer fit, but they kept having to put it on each and every morning. When Jake first got there, they collected samples of the concrete, some of the rebar, some spray paint. They were determined to find something worthy of research. After 4 weeks, they'd gotten sick of getting no replies from admin, and they cracked the locks on the filing cabinet, finding the research notes of all the previous researchers. All of the legendary doctor's notes turned out to be doodles and random to-do lists which had nothing to do with the object. After 6 weeks, they gave up on taking samples. After 8 weeks, they brought a Game Boy. After 10, they started bringing in anything they could to pass the time. A yo-yo, a collection of short stories, a packet of hot sauce they felt bad throwing away, a piece of string to cut off circulation to their index finger for no other reason than to make sure they were still a human relying on blood. Oh yes, Jake Skull was bored. So very bored. They thought if anyone could bring the phrase bored to death to fruition, it would be them. These days, they shuffled in, waved at the guard, and sat down at their little control room where there was a terminal, which, by the way, didn't have an internet connection, and tried to stay sane. Fast forward a few years and Jake barely fit into his chair. To clarify, no, they did not purchase a new tiny chair out of boredom. They got fat out of boredom. Their life brought them no joy. And so, what they couldn't get from living, they searched for in eating. But there was no fulfillment to be found at the center of the Tootsie Pop. Jake stood with a grunt as the light came on, and the 3D class were escorted to the control room with the mops and buckets in tow. "Thanks, Jimmy," was the only conversation they had with the new security staff. The old guard had retired sometime in the 8th year. Honestly, Jake couldn't even remember. The D-class had gotten older too, most of them now gray-haired but still assigned to the project. The security guard walked over and thumbed towards the break room. "Hey, Jake, I'm gonna get coffee. If anything happens, seal the door. You know the drill. Just keep an eye on the D's." Jake buzzed the doors open and stood inside the doorframe, keeping their eyes on the statue most of the time, but wandering over the containment chamber. A long time ago, they might have been concerned, but the D-classes they worked with weren't very violent. Frankly, they had worked with these men long enough that they extended a small measure of trust. All of them did their jobs without complaining and never had made a mistake in 10 years. While the years of repetition wore them out, the job itself didn't even feel like labor. They had perfected the art of the staring contest. They were confident, and they had reason to be. As the years went on, although they collected no new data on SCP-173, they did collect evidence that they were capable of containing it. While they learned nothing new of importance about SCP-173, they learned about themselves. They learned that they were a good crew, and it was because of this confidence, even if rightfully earned, that success crumbled. When in a room with SCP-173, you have to assume everything will go wrong, because anything can go wrong, and eventually it will. And when that time comes, you have to be prepared. Procedure said Jake had to have someone armed in the room with any D-class. Jake looked down at their hip, double-checked the pistol there. They knew how to use it, but figured he never would have to draw it. The routine cleaning began. Clear, clear, Clear. It was the same old, until suddenly it wasn't. Clear. Oh no, I think I'm having a snap. What? Hey, Nick, are you? Snap. Oh god, no, I don't wanna. Snap. Jake's eyes shot up as the statue stood inches away. Its green eyes stared directly into their soul. In their periphery, Jake could see the 3D class with their head turned at odd angles. Jake desperately reached out for the emergency containment button on the wall. They hadn't ever had to use it, and it was supposed to be easy to find. But of course, it wasn't. They recalled the manual saying, "Move your hand anywhere along the right-hand wall. The button takes up most of the wall. It will seal off the containment chamber and SCP-173 from breaching containment." They moved their hand exactly how their memory of the manual instructed him, but it wasn't there. There was nothing to press. There was nothing to save them. Jake's hands grew desperate and their eyes began to water. Just as they started to close, a last thought crossed their mind. Move your hand anywhere along the left-hand wall. The button takes up most of the wall. It will seal off the containment chamber and SCP-173 from breaching containment. Of course, a classic mix-up. 50-50 chances never favored the flustered. Their fight-or-flight instincts were contradicting each other. Was reaching for a button fighting, or was it flighting? They were in their head, deep in trenches of overthinking. Finally, they regained their composure. Their hand darted out to the left and they started to push down on the button. The red of the emergency button filled their vision as the green eyes of SCP-173 slipped just barely out of snap. Director Kinsley stood outside of the meeting room a few minutes before the weekly briefing in the Site-2117 Administrative Wing. Fordham, do you remember Jake Skoll? Oh yeah, sure do. Just got a report from 19. Looks like there was a breach and they bid it. Fordham waved off a few colleagues who were about to enter the meeting room. His conversation with Director Kinsley wasn't over. He went on to tell him that he was just about to approve Jake Skoll's transfer. After all these years, Jake had been sending requests to leave SCP-173. Their wish was about to be granted, but instead they were reassigned to the grave. What a cruel twist, isn't it? That is, of course, if it were actually true. Fordham gave his patented smirk. Just kidding. The only researchers to ever get out of that post needed friends in very high places. Skoll, to his detriment, did not. So what exactly did Skoll do to deserve this? It is known that those who are sent to SCP-173 have made mistakes. If you disrespect your boss, you might be reassigned to SCP-173. If you don't follow Foundation policy, you might be reassigned to SCP-173. If you leak information to the public, you might be reassigned to SCP-173. If you are Jake Skoll, however, it doesn't take quite as much. So I will pose the question once more. What horrible thing could Jake have done? Could they have been plotting to help an array of SCPs escape? Could they have been smuggling dangerous equipment from the lab and selling it on the black market? Could they have somehow been responsible for every casualty in Foundation history? Or could it have been something much, much smaller? Like occasionally parking in their boss's favorite spot on Site-217. A lot, you must understand, which doesn't have assigned parking.
Facing the council wasn't the daunting part. It was when the council turned their faces away that things became truly terrifying. Dr. Moto pleaded as he watched, his heart sinking as one by one, the members of the O5 Council literally turned their backs to him. Standing beneath the almost blinding spotlight overhead, he tried to look around the dimly lit chamber, searching for a way out, some kind of emergency exit he could rush toward, though he knew there was no hope of making it in time. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. It was just enough to catch his attention. Vines or tentacles splayed out and reached for him from behind. Their reddish-brown tint, caused by rust and blood, told him the sculpture was behind him. It had stopped for now. Seeing it in his peripheral vision was enough to hold it still. A quantum lock, one of the Foundation doctors had called it, the ultimate defense mechanism. Dr. Moto had once believed this too, but now he wasn't so sure. This wasn't part of the anomaly's defense. It was a trap. It was left unobserved so often, almost constantly, except during periodic cleanings. In those moments when nobody was looking, the sculpture was free to move. Personnel had heard scraping sounds when no one was inside the containment room. It hadn't just been free to move, it had been free to plot. to change. Now Moto was stuck, unable to look away from the anomaly, aware that as soon as he did, his life would end. The council would keep their backs turned until Dr. Moto's body fell, lifeless, his neck broken. Slowly, Moto turned to face the anomaly, his gaze trailing up the winding rebar appendages, which would seize his throat the moment his aching eyes blinked. Its body, a large chunk of concrete vaguely shaped like a torso, gave way to a head with a spray-painted face above an open midsection of twisted rebar below. The rebar looked like intestines, as if the sculpture's guts were spilling out, aided by the red tint of dried blood. More rebar appendages protruded like legs from the lower part of the concrete. This wasn't the SCP-173 he remembered. It had changed. It used to look more like a statue, deliberately shaped by an anomalous artist. But nobody else remembered the old SCP-173. Everyone had called Dr. Moto insane for claiming that this new anomaly bore little resemblance to the sculpture he knew, and his word should have carried more authority on the matter. After all, he was the one who had first discovered SCP-173 all those years ago. The new SCP-173's lifeless concrete face was inches away. Even though it only had 2 hollow spaces on its spray-painted face that resembled eyes, it felt like the sculpture was glaring at him, accusingly. Dr. Moto's eyes began to water, urging him to blink, but he forced himself to keep looking. Don't blink, he thought, if he could hold on just a little longer. Several hours later, alarms blared as blood-red lights flashed through the hallways of SCP Foundation Site-19. Inside SCP-173's containment chamber, 3 personnel lay dead on the floor, one still clutching a mop in their cold, stiff fingers. It had been a routine bi-weekly cleaning. It should have been mundane, but the 2 members of personnel assigned to observe SCP-173 had blinked, thinking they were safe. With the 3rd person's back turned, SCP-173 had moved, snapping all of their necks. None of them had seen what killed them. Immediately, Class 4 hazardous object containment procedures were put into effect. Security teams rounded up groups of D-Class personnel, 2 to observe, 1 to place a cage around SCP-173. Once secured, they used a forklift or any other means to move the sculpture back to its cell. But there was just one problem. In the split second SCP-173 had been unobserved after breaking out of its cell, it had vanished. Nobody had thought to watch the outside of its containment chamber during cleaning. After all, the procedure was routine. But this time, the sculpture had used the opportunity to flee Site-19 altogether. Dr. Moto received the call moments later and was rushed to Site-19. His expertise with SCP-173 was unmatched, as he had been the one to discover the anomalous statue back in 2007 aboard a decommissioned U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. The Foundation hoped that consulting Moto would help track down the missing anomaly, but the moment he was shown security footage, he knew something was wrong. The Foundation had slowed down footage from Site-19's internal surveillance, scanning frame by frame until they found grainy stills of SCP-173 escaping the facility. But something was off. This was not the sculpture Dr. Moto had discovered. The Foundation personnel around him exchanged concerned glances. The image on screen was blurry, catching the sculpture in motion, but they all recognized it as SCP-173. Dr. Moto, though, insisted that the anomaly was bipedal, walking on 2 legs instead of multiple twisted rebar poles seen on this one. Its concrete skin had been a pale yellow, with traces of Krylon brand spray paint making up its crude facial features, with a bigger, more rotunded head. Nervously, researchers looked with uncertainty at the senior Foundation doctor. Not one of them had heard of the anomaly he was describing. Dr. Moto stormed out, frustrated and confused. Why did nobody else remember what SCP-173 looked like? Where had this new version of what was seemingly the same anomaly suddenly appeared from? As his mind raced, his cell phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered out of habit. On the other end was a voice he hadn't heard in years, one that he had all but forgotten. When SCP-173 was first discovered, the boat it had been hiding on was taken to a Foundation-owned salvage yard. Moto had asked a security guard, Jim to contact him if there was ever any unusual activity aboard the decommissioned aircraft carrier. Now, all these years later, something was happening on the wreck of the USS Walrus, and Jim had kept his word. As Dr. Moto raced to the salvage yard, something heavy was crashing through the USS Walrus. Nobody had set foot aboard the Walrus since 2007, or rather, nobody human had. Although it didn't remember how, SCP-173, the original version, had somehow appeared there some time ago, as if its decades spent locked up by the SCP Foundation had been little more than a bad dream. Now it was back in the closest thing to a home it had ever known, and free to move around unobserved. For a time, the old SCP-173 had been peacefully living in the belly of the USS Walrus, completely unaware that back in its containment chamber at the Foundation, another anomaly, identical in every way save for its appearance, had taken its place. Until that anomaly came bursting through the walls of the abandoned shipwreck. Rebar tendrils tore through the ship's weakened metal hull as the new SCP-173 forced its way inside. It moved swiftly, unobserved, driven by a singular instinctive purpose to find and destroy the other. Its rusted limbs snaked around pipes, and its senses honed in on the presence of its older counterpart aboard the ship. The sound of tearing metal echoed like an enraged animal's cry as the new SCP-173 ripped through walls, decimating everything in its path. Inside the bowels of the USS Walrus, the original SCP-173 sensed the intrusion. It had been living in the wreckage unbothered for years, but now something fearsome and unfamiliar had entered its home. The new version of SCP-173, while physically similar, radiated a hostility that the old sculpture could almost feel. The new version of the sculpture snarled, or would have if it had a mouth. Much like its predecessor, the anomaly had no face beyond a crudely painted facsimile of one. But that also meant that neither of them had eyes. The two anomalies now faced each other in the dim light of the ship's abandoned corridors. The new SCP-173 moved first, charging at the original, its rebar limbs lashing out at blinding speeds. The older version reacted instinctively, dodging just in time. Despite being unobserved, both anomalies could move at incredible speeds. So fast, in fact, that any human observer would barely be able to track their motions. But here, in the ship's isolated corridors, they were free to battle at full force. The new SCP-173 was faster, stronger, and more aggressive, its rebar tendrils wrapping around the neck of the older sculpture. The original struggled as cracks formed in its concrete body under the pressure, but it fought back with a desperate kick, knocking one of the new sculpture's rebar legs out from under it. The new version toppled forward, momentarily loosening its grip. The old SCP-173 seized the opportunity to break free, darting down the narrow corridor, trying to put as much distance as possible between itself and its relentless pursuer. The old SCP-173 knew it couldn't win this fight, not with sheer force. The new version was simply too powerful. Its only option was to escape, to find a way off the ship, or at least hide long enough to avoid destruction. But with every move it made, the new SCP-173 was right behind, tearing through the walls and corridors in its furious pursuit. Outside, Dr. Moto reached the salvage yard, rushing past the small security office and following Jim's directions to the wreck of the USS Walrus. The sounds of metal crashing and heavy stone scraping against the ship's interior were unmistakable. Something was happening inside, and it wasn't good. Moto's heart raced as he approached the ship. Suddenly, he stopped, his eyes widening in shock. A massive dent had appeared in the ship's outer hull, as if something, or someone, inside was smashing its way through. Inside the ship, the new SCP-173 had caught up to the original. With a powerful swing, it slammed the older sculpture against the wall, leaving a deep impression in the metal. The new version was stronger, more aggressive, and had a clear advantage. The original SCP-173 tried to fight back, but it knew it couldn't match the new version's sheer force. As the new sculpture's rebar limbs wrapped around its body, lifting it off the ground, the old SCP-173 realized it had no way to escape. There was only one way this could end. The new SCP-173 prepared to deliver the final blow. It hoisted the original high above its head, ready to slam down and shatter the older sculpture into pieces. If it had a mouth, it would have roared in triumph. But just as it was about to strike, both anomalies froze. They were being watched. A mobile task force had arrived, storming into the wreckage of the walrus just in time. Their weapons raised, laser sights trained on both sculptures. The presence of observers instantly triggered SCP-173's quantum lock, freezing both versions in place. The old sculpture was suspended in midair, held above the head of the new version, inches away from being destroyed. Dr. Moto rushed into the ship behind the task force, insisting to the operatives that the older version was the real SCP-173. This new monstrosity must be some sort of related anomaly that had somehow taken its place in containment. But as Moto argued, the MTF commander received an order in his earpiece. Lowering his weapon, the commander motioned for his men to do the same. Silently, solemnly, they turned their backs on the two sculptures.
Wait, what are you doing?
Moto yelled, panicking.
You can't turn away. The second you'll stop watching, they'll...
Everything went dark as a bag was slipped over Moto's head. The task force restrained him, their orders clear. They were to take Dr. Moto to the O5 Council, who would decide his fate. As Moto struggled in their grip, the deafening sound of concrete smashing against metal echoed through the ship's interior. Though he couldn't see it, Moto could imagine what was happening. The new SCP-173 was finishing what it had started. It was slamming the older sculpture against the walls, breaking apart its concrete shell piece by piece, until nothing remained but rebar and dust. When the noise finally stopped, Moto was dragged away by the task force. His vision was still obscured by the dark bag over his head. Their orders were clear. Take him to the O5 Council. They would decide what to do with him, after explaining what had truly happened to SCP-173. It had been getting slower. The longer the days, weeks, months, and years went on, the more time it took to move. Long before the collapse, it used to move like lightning. In the blink of a human eye, it could go from one side of a room to the other. It had moved with such speed that it looked to have disappeared from one place and reappeared in another. By the time the same human's eye reopened, there it would be, standing before them. And as they realized that they had to strain to keep their eyes open and stare at it, it would wait until they inevitably had to blink again. That was when it would strike. But now its movements were getting sluggish. It had been able to move around of its own volition for some time after the collapse, unobserved and thus free for the first time in a long while. Yet now it was succumbing to the one thing it couldn't move faster than, the one thing that makes dust of all things, time. A sound, suddenly and faintly, but undoubtedly caused by movement. A human, a victim. It turned to see the man enter the room, stopping still as his gaze fell over it. All it had to do was wait. The agent could barely believe his eyes. The second he'd spotted the sculpture, he'd instinctively frozen to the spot, rigid with sheer terror, heart drumming against his ribcage. Standing across the room from it, directly opposite, he kept himself as still as the concrete and rebar statue was. The agent knew that as long as he looked at it, it couldn't move. He just had to make sure he didn't so much as blink, or at least that's how it used to work. To his horror, the agent noticed that the arm of SCP-173 started to slowly reach towards him. But how? How had the sculpture, an anomaly once capable of moving only while unobserved, found a way to suddenly start reaching for this agent? Well, for a start, that has something to do with the particular Foundation operative who was looking at SCP-173, and technically wasn't at the same time. Let us start at the beginning. You see, some time ago, a former field agent working at the SCP Foundation suffered quite an unprecedented accident. Let's call him Daryl, a seemingly average man in his 30s, well, as average as someone working for the Foundation can be. However, one mission would unexpectedly change Daryl's life forever, turning him into SCP-451. It started as a straightforward retrieval operation, Daryl was instructed to recover a dangerous anomalous artifact. However, he ultimately failed and was declared missing in action as a result. That is, until he miraculously resurfaced a month later at Site-19. But from Daryl's point of view, the entire Foundation facility looked like it had been deserted. Corridors and labs that had previously been bustling hives of activity were now unsettlingly empty. SCPs seemed to still be in their containment chambers, but without anyone watching or guarding them. As far as SCP-451 knew, he was the only man still alive on Earth. Some anomalous influence had left him with a unique affliction, a permanently altered perception. Daryl was rendered incapable of seeing other human beings. It wasn't just limited to his sight either. He couldn't hear anyone or even perceive their existence. Any attempts the Foundation's researchers made to communicate with SCP-451 were unsuccessful. They could still see him, but it was like he was absent, standing just outside the real world. And yet to Daryl, it was somehow worse than that. Given the lack of people around him, being unable to see, hear, or interact with anyone, SCP-451 quickly adopted the belief that by interacting with the anomalous artifact, he had single-handedly wiped out the entire human race. While this wasn't true, he had no way of knowing that everyone else was still alive. He just couldn't perceive them. The guilt instilled in Daryl weighed heavily on the agent's conscience. He spent a lot of time wandering the corridors of Site-19, overwhelmed by his apparent isolation, convinced he'd single-handedly caused the extinction of the human race. But what does SCP-451 have to do with SCP-173? How did Daryl go from being unable to see and hear other humans to staring down the sculpture? Well, while Daryl was suffering from his newly altered perception, something catastrophic was unfolding in the wider world he could hardly interact with anymore. An end-of-the-world scenario had taken place and left barely any survivors, making the perceived extinction of humanity by SCP-451 oddly prophetic. Something had caused the human race to actually die out, and with nobody around who could explain what had happened, the actual how and why were forgotten to history. And even if someone had managed to survive, SCP-451 would still be as oblivious to their explanations as he was to the disaster that claimed the lives of not only the whole SCP Foundation, but the rest of the world, too. Of course, without the Foundation and its personnel around any longer to safeguard the rest of humanity, or even anything left of humanity for them to protect, things quickly got even worse. The various contained SCPs soon found themselves free to run amok. Whatever had wiped the human race from existence left the world mostly uninhabited, and it didn't take long for some of the more aggressive anomalies to turn on each other. With no humans for them to prey on, they had to make do. But while they fought, killed, and died in the ruins of the world, one was left to roam freer than it had ever been: SCP-173. Now that the sculpture was no longer caged by the Foundation, it could move around unobserved. Before, it would be frozen in place whenever personnel entered its cell to clean it every 2 weeks, constantly watching it to stop it from moving. But now there were no personnel. After the human race had been wiped out, SCP-173 set about bursting free from its container. It took quite some time, using its heavy concrete and rebar arms to dent the walls from within, continually pounding on the metal until it eventually gave way. Bursting free, SCP-173 found itself in a world with hardly anyone around to look at it, and that meant it could go anywhere it wanted, do anything it pleased, so long as none of the other surviving SCPs came across it. That did happen from time to time, of course. Any of the more humanoid anomalies that were capable of sight would sometimes stumble upon the sculpture, but they had to blink sometime, and when they did, SCP-173 would effortlessly zip over to where they stood and break their necks. Exercising its newfound freedom, SCP-173 moved unnoticed to the office of Dr. Alto Clef, the infamously unhinged Foundation researcher, weapons fanatic, and specialist in decommissioning SCPs. Clef, like the rest of the human race, was nowhere to be found when the sculpture burst into his office. If it had the capacity for emotions, maybe it felt angered,
even cheated to find that Clef was gone. It had seemed to have come seeking revenge. For a number of years, Dr. Clef had been infatuated with SCP-173. Were he still alive, Clef himself would have described the anomalous statue as a former flame, someone he had a bond with. Although he had no idea how one-sided his feelings truly were, the sculpture, if it could feel, would have been indifferent towards the crazed researcher were it not for date night. Clef had, on a number of occasions, dressed as SCP-173 in a black dress and a blonde wig, and shared romantic evenings in its company. It's never been known if SCP-173 is just an object with anomalous movement properties, or if the sculpture is an actual living creature with sentience. But if it was, then no doubt being made to go on repeated dates with Dr. Clef would have humiliated SCP-173. And as it searched Clef's office, while it couldn't find the loathsome researcher, it did find a certain black dress and wig that the sculpture quickly crushed under the weight of its heavy, stony arms. It wasn't Dr. Clef being smashed, but it was enough. Meanwhile, SCP-451 still remained completely unaware that everyone else was gone. To him, nothing had changed. He still couldn't perceive anyone, not that there was anyone around anyway. He'd witnessed a lot of destruction unfurled by the anomalous breaking their containment, but most didn't pay Daryl any mind. Ones that did quickly found they couldn't interact with him or cause the former Foundation agent harm, and quickly lost interest in him. That was an added torturous part of SCP-451's condition. He couldn't die. A long time before the end of the world scenario, Daryl had found a firearm belonging to another member of Foundation personnel in the main break room of Site-19. As SCP-451 tried to fire the weapon, the bullet ricocheted off the wall and the gunshot passed directly through him. The same bullet mortally wounded another nearby member of Foundation staff, and it was after he'd accidentally injured this unsuspecting researcher that SCP-451 found he was briefly able to interact with them, right as the researcher's life was fading. That was the last time he'd been able to see anyone, well, any human anyway. But then, he encountered SCP-173. The pair of them came face to face with each other in the ruins of a Foundation site. By that point, the overwhelming loneliness of believing himself to be humanity's sole survivor had already taken a bad toll on Daryl. He was losing himself, every day getting more and more overwhelmed by the anomalous hell he was living. SCP-173 was caught for a moment when SCP-451 walked in on it, stuck fast like it had been whenever someone observed it. But as Daryl stared and tried not to blink, the sculpture found itself still able to move. It could see SCP-451 and he could see it, yet it could still move. Somehow, due to the way Daryl's perception had been anomalously altered, it affected the way he saw the sculpture. It was almost like he was seeing it without seeing. It had been so long since humanity disappeared that the sculpture's movements had been gradually getting slower. The rebar holding it together had been rusting, creaking more as it bent and twisted. Its concrete parts were starting to crumble away. And now, despite being free, it was struggling just to reach an arm out to SCP-451 to kill him. For his part, SCP-451 had been forced to live out a painful existence, spending each and every day alone. As delirium had begun to sink its claws into him, Daryl had wished for one thing: some company, and now he'd found it. Misinterpreting SCP-173's arm extending towards him, SCP-451 broke down crying and embraced the sculpture. His tears ran down the anomalous statue's decaying concrete body, the struts in its arms creaking as it tried to reach for Daryl. But the sculpture was getting old, too old to kill as quick as it used to. Time and loneliness, two of the most painful things to experience the side effect of. And yet, while SCP-173 continued to wither, it was unknowingly helping alleviate someone else's pain. Although it could still move while SCP-451 looked at it, Daryl didn't leave the sculpture alone. In his mind, driven half-mad by being isolated for so long, he genuinely believed that SCP-173 and he were friends.
The sculpture had spared him after all. SCP-451 had no idea what had happened to the rest of the human race, and the other SCPs now loose on the world barely acknowledged him. But in the concrete and rebar statue, he found a friend. SCP-451 followed SCP-173 as it shuffled itself away, not leaving its side, matching the slowed speed of its stony, scraping movements. As they wandered together, Daryl poured his heart out about everything and anything, glad to have someone, anyone to talk to, even if the sculpture couldn't reply. Again, nobody knows for sure if SCP-173 was an object or a living creature, but if it was the latter, then there's still no telling how it perceived SCP-451. It could have taken pity on him, maybe sympathizing with his plight and begrudgingly alleviating his solitude. Or it might have found Daryl to be a nuisance. We'll never know, and neither would SCP-451. As the years passed, SCP-173 continued to slow down and kept withering. Portions of its concrete body crumbled until they were little more than dust. The metal wired through the sculpture rusted, eventually coming to a stop. What was left of SCP-173 stopped moving, fixed to one spot where it would stay. Forever still. Not realizing it had perished, SCP-451 sat beside it and kept talking. Now go check out SCP-096 vs. SCP-173 and SCP-173 Origin Story How 173 Got to Site-19 for more killer sculpture.